A deep crisis settled over Rome and the whole of Italy at a moment when the Republic could least afford it. The social war had barely faded, its wounds still raw, when a new storm gathered both at home and in the east. The concessions granted to the Italian allies had been offered grudgingly, hedged with humiliating restrictions that emptied them of real value. Instead of reconciliation, these half measures bred resentment. At the same time, Mithradates of Pontus struck at Roman power in Asia, exposing how fragile the empire had become. Responsibility for this dangerous hour lay with many hands. Popular leaders pushed reckless schemes, yet the stubborn short-sightedness of the ruling elite proved equally destructive. By clinging to the purity of the franchise and fearing the dilution of their privilege, they drove new citizens into the arms of radicals and turned potential supporters into enemies. Rome itself was a powder keg. Exiles plotted to return, financiers raged over losses abroad, and debt weighed heavily on every class. The army, swollen by civil conflict, had drifted away from civic loyalty and learned to follow commanders rather than laws. Discipline weakened, personal rivalries poisoned public life, and violence became an accepted tool. Out of this atmosphere emerged two decisive figures: Gaius Marius, the aging hero hungry for one last command, and Publius Sulpicius Rufus, a talented tribune whose course would drag the Republic toward open revolution. Marius, despite years and illness, trained publicly among the young soldiers and poured his wealth into winning influence. Sulpicius, once considered moderate, now embraced daring reforms. He proposed distributing the new citizens among all tribes, recalling political exiles, and even expelling heavily indebted senators. These measures, though not radical in principle, threatened entrenched interests and were forced through by intimidation and street gangs. The consuls tried to halt the votes by proclaiming a religious holiday. But Sulpicius answered with organized violence. Blood was shed in the Forum, and the authority of the Senate collapsed. Soon an even bolder step followed. The Asiatic command, legally assigned to the consul Lucius Cornelius Sulla, was transferred by popular decree to Marius. This act struck at the heart of constitutional order. Sulla, then with the legions in Campania, faced a choice no Roman general had yet confronted. To surrender meant humiliation and political ruin. To resist meant civil war. Sulla was a complex man, cultivated and cynical, fond of pleasure yet capable of iron discipline. He believed in the fortune that favoured him and despised the disorder of popular politics. Supported by soldiers eager for the riches of the East, he decided to march on Rome itself. The advance was unprecedented. Magistrates tried to bar the road, but the army brushed them aside. At the city gates, fighting broke out in the narrow streets, and for the first time Roman legions stormed their own capital. The forces of Sulpicius and Marius, a mixture of freedmen and partisans, could not withstand professional troops. By nightfall, the city was in Sulla's hands. The Sulpician laws were annulled, and leading opponents were declared outlaws. Sulpicius was captured and executed, his head displayed as a warning. Marius fled, beginning a desperate journey along the Italian coast. Tales spread of his wanderings through marshes, his narrow escapes, and the awe he inspired even in captivity. Eventually, he reached Africa, sitting among the ruins of Carthage, a symbol of fallen greatness, awaiting another turn of fate. Sulla's seizure of Rome marked a turning point far greater than the fate of individuals. Force had openly triumphed over law, and the army had revealed itself as the true master of politics. The precedent would haunt the Republic, inviting others to imitate what had been done in the name of order. Beneath the appearance of moderation lay a revolution more profound than any decree of the tribunes. The old balance between Senate people, and magistrates was broken, and the stage was set for years of vengeance and counter-vengeance. Rome had entered an age in which victory belonged not to the just or the legal, but to the commander bold enough to march. Sulla had taken Rome by force, but he did not pretend that swords alone could hold the Republic together. Once the immediate resistance was broken, his next move was political. He wanted to rebuild the system so that the Senate and the traditional elite could dominate again, and so that popular officials and mass voting assemblies could no longer push the state into chaos the way they had in the previous century. The goal was not to invent a new constitution, but to lock the old one into place with hard rules, because the old habits of restraint and unwritten understandings had stopped working. One of his first concerns was the Senate itself. Years of war and faction fighting had thinned its ranks and damaged its authority. He looked for ways to restore its numbers and stability by adding reliable supporters from the upper class. Although the exact method and how fully it was carried out is unclear. More important than the headcount was control. Sulla aimed to make the Senate the gatekeeper of legislation, not merely a body that complained after the fact. Tribunes, who had become the main launchpad for popular agitation, were stripped of their independent power to introduce laws freely. Any proposal coming from them would need prior approval from the Senate. That single change was designed to cut the fuse before it reached the powder. He also tried to reduce the political weight of the tribal voting assembly, which had grown into a dominant force over generations. There were even claims that he attempted to remove or heavily limit the ability of the tribes to legislate at all, and to reshape voting procedures, so that the wealthiest citizens would always have the decisive advantage. In theory, that meant returning elections for top magistrates to the firm grip of property and status. Whether such a sweeping rollback could truly function in practice is another matter. The older voting system had been revised and bent so many times over the centuries that fully restoring it would have meant dragging living politics back into something like a museum display. Even so, the intention is clear. Keep the highest offices in the hands of the rich and reduce the influence of the street, the clubs, and the sudden mood of the crowd. At the same time, Sulla did not ignore the social pressure that fed unrest. He introduced measures meant to ease poverty and debt, partly from pragmatism. The city poor and the indebted could not be allowed to become a permanent revolutionary fuel supply. In that sense, his program was a mixture of hard restriction and calculated relief. Close the political doors, but throw enough bread into the room to quiet the shouting. To many observers, his reforms looked brutal and extreme, yet they were also presented as a kind of cold realism. No serious faction wanted the Senate abolished. The state could not function without it. Without a controlling centre, Rome risked being torn apart by rival magistrates, personal gangs, and a mass assembly that could be pushed by fear, bribery, or rage. The old religious delays, the vetoes, and the traditional deference that had once slowed down bad decisions were no longer respected. In that atmosphere, the argument for writing strict limits into law became easier to make. Even the attempt to give the wealthier classes a stronger grip on elections could be defended as an anti-corruption measure, since the electorate had become a marketplace where votes could be bought and sold. And even the political killings and outlaw lists, shocking as they were, did not come from nowhere. Rome had already seen bloodshed in earlier crises, and violence had been normalized long before Sulla arrived. But none of this solved the deeper sickness. The Senate's decline was not only the result of popular agitation, it also came from the greed, incompetence, and moral decay of the nobles themselves. Changing voting procedures could not manufacture virtue, and legal patches could not fix an economy where wealth and poverty were drifting into dangerous extremes. Sulla did little to calm hatreds between factions, little to reduce the bitter sense that Rome was split into permanent enemies. His reforms aimed to restrain symptoms, not to heal the causes. Worse, his own actions had taught a lesson far more powerful than any statute. When politics becomes desperate, force decides. He could not even stay to guard the system he had redesigned. The Eastern crisis demanded immediate attention, and every month of delay made it worse. Yet Italy itself was still unstable. Some of Rome's old enemies in the peninsula were not fully subdued. A number of towns still resisted, and many communities remained uncertain about their future status. The newly enfranchised Italians, promised inclusion but treated with suspicion, were angry and restless. In Rome, the restricted electorate produced an uneasy pairing of leaders. One, a rigid defender of the old order, the other, a man with a dangerous reputation and popular backing. In the north, soldiers mutinied and murdered a commander closely linked to Sulla. The situation was fragile enough that Sulla chose not to confront every threat at once. Instead, he extracted public oaths of loyalty from the leading magistrates, left trusted deputies to finish operations against the remaining resistance in Italy, and sailed east. Whatever his private motives, duty, ambition, calculation, his departure had a clear effect. The structure he built began to crack almost immediately. While Rome tore itself apart, the eastern Mediterranean had been sliding into disorder. Roman attention had been consumed by internal conflict, and the old powers of the region were weakening. Egypt was caught in dynastic struggles. Syria was breaking into fragments. Across the Near East, local rulers, cities, tribes, and sea raiders exploited the chaos, carving out space for themselves. The Roman province in Asia had become notorious. Tax collectors and officials squeezed it relentlessly, pushing communities into debt, bankruptcy, and despair. Extortion created a chain reaction. Loans became traps, farms were exhausted, free people were dragged into slavery, and resentment spread beyond the provincial borders into neighbouring lands. Rome's name came to be spoken with disgust. Yet Rome kept only a thin military presence and failed to police the seas properly. Corruption was so common that territories could be treated like merchandise, gained or lost through bribery and influence rather than policy. In that landscape, three kingdoms rose into special prominence: Parthia, Armenia, and Pontus. Parthia, stretching deep into the east, was still distant from Rome's everyday calculations. But its position mattered because it watched Armenia carefully and had reasons to prefer friendly relations with the Western Republic. Armenia, under a strong ruler, grew ambitious and projected power outward, presenting itself as a major monarchy rather than a secondary state. Yet the sharpest danger for Rome came from Pontus, a rugged region along the Black Sea coast that had avoided full conquest by earlier empires and had kept a line of native rulers. Over time, it acquired a major coastal base and a fleet, and its kings learned how to use the sea as both shield and weapon. The man who turned Pontus into a true challenger was Mithradates. Stories gathered around his early life, some heroic, some dark, the kind of legends that flourish around rulers who inspire both fear and fascination. However much myth wrapped around him, the political reality was clear. He combined personal force with careful organisation. He used Greek education and Greek expertise as tools, not as a change of identity. He recruited talented Greek commanders and administrators, studied military methods, and built institutions that could support expansion. At the same time, he displayed the brutal habits often associated with royal courts in the East: suspicion, sudden violence, ruthless punishment, and a readiness to treat friends and relatives as disposable if they seemed threatening. He could be generous when it served him, and savage when angered. He cultivated the image of a heroic king, yet the engine behind the image was power. Pontus, under Mithradates, was not a typical city-based state. Its interior was dotted with forts and storehouses, and its population included many rural and tribal communities, only lightly touched by the urban culture of the Mediterranean. That structure made it resilient. Mithradates expanded first toward the north and east. He moved into Colchis, tightened his grip on key ports and settlements, pressed into the Crimea, and extended influence across the Black Sea world. Nomadic warriors and coastal Greeks were drawn into his orbit for different reasons. Some were forced, some bribed, some persuaded by the promise of protection against other raiders. The Greek cities on the Black Sea, neglected by bigger powers and threatened by nearby tribes, often welcomed him as a sponsor and shield. From these lands he gained grain, revenue, and cavalry, and he created a maritime system that made the Black Sea feel like his private domain. Expansion widened his ambitions. He absorbed Lesser Armenia and formed a strategic partnership with the Armenian king, strengthened by marriage ties. The arrangement allowed Armenia to push south and east, while Pontus applied pressure across Asia Minor. The first major targets were the vulnerable buffer zones, Paphlagonia, Cappadocia, and the shifting borderlands where client kings and rival claimants constantly competed. Mithradates moved skillfully through this political maze using pretenders, marriages, and legal claims when convenient, and direct force when needed. Rival kings in the region tried the same methods, and Rome, distracted by threats closer to home, responded with little more than warnings and occasional interventions. That hesitancy gave Mithradates room to grow. Cappadocia became a key battleground because control there meant control of routes and influence across central Anatolia. Local kings were murdered, puppets installed, and rival claimants backed by neighbouring monarchs. When Sulla first arrived in the east on an earlier command, the situation was already alarming. Rome had allowed a strong, organised power to rise along its frontier, with a massive army, a growing fleet, and alliances that could be activated quickly. Yet Rome still relied more on reputation than on preparation. Sulla, with limited forces but backed by the memory of earlier Roman victories, pushed Mithradates' agents out of Cappadocia. Mithradates temporarily stepped back, blamed subordinates, withdrew pretenders, and made promises. A new ruler was placed on the Cappadocian throne through local selection, and for a moment it looked like a settlement. It was not. As soon as Rome's attention was pulled back into crisis at home, Mithradates resumed pressure. He encouraged Armenian action, stalled on withdrawals, and continued campaigns around the Black Sea. Rome could have overlooked some of it, but the situation became more dangerous when Bithynia, an important neighbour that acted as a buffer, fell into a succession struggle. A rival claimant appeared with Pontic support, and the rightful king was driven out. That threatened to shift the balance directly on the edge of Rome's province in Asia. Rome answered not with a full war, but with a diplomatic mission backed by military display. Once again, a show of strength was enough to restore the displaced kings, at least on the surface. Mithradates avoided open battle, sacrificed a pawn when necessary, and presented himself as reasonable, while continuing to operate through agents and allies. He behaved like a ruler who understood timing. He was not yet ready to gamble everything on a direct collision with Rome, and Rome, strained by its own wars, was not ready to commit the resources to crush him completely. Both sides drifted toward the confrontation that almost everyone could see coming, yet neither moved decisively to prevent it. The stage was set for a larger war, built not from a single sudden attack, but from years of neglect, corruption, ambition, and repeated compromises that solved nothing. Aquilius did not arrive in Asia to calm a border dispute. He arrived like a man who expected the East to move at Rome's command, and he chose the worst possible moment to press that belief. Rome was exhausted, divided, and distracted, yet he pushed the crisis forward anyway. He urged the young king of Bithynia, Rome's client, and importantly, a ruler deeply entangled in debt and dependence, to act aggressively. Under this pressure, Nicomedes moved to enforce an evacuation in contested territory, shut down access points on the Black Sea, threatened coastal towns, and drove his forces toward the frontier of Pontus. Mithradates responded with what sounded, on the surface, like a restrained demand. Either the aggressor should be recalled or Pontus should be allowed to defend itself. Aquilius refused both. He ordered Mithradates not to resist and assembled 3 separate forces under Roman commanders, composed largely of local auxiliaries, to support the Bithynian advance on the edge of Pontic and Cappadocian lands. In practical terms, that was a declaration of war without admitting it. Once pushed into a corner, Mithradates reacted with speed and scale. He did not prepare for a limited border clash. He mobilized as if the entire Roman presence in the east could be uprooted. Armenia offered support and shielded his position from the rear. A vast army was drawn together from across Asia Minor, the Caucasus, and the steppe regions, supported by a fleet, staffed and commanded by sailors from multiple eastern seas. His senior officers were experienced Greek professionals, men who knew how to command mixed forces, how to supply them, and how to exploit Roman weaknesses. Envoys moved through royal courts, searching for allies and encouraging trouble far from the battlefield. Pirate squadrons, now operating like unofficial warships, struck at transport routes and severed communications. Even the composition of his army was calculated for propaganda as much as for battle. Along with tribal levies and Greek recruits were Roman deserters and Italian refugees. Living proof that Rome's own conflicts could be turned into weapons. The most powerful force, however, was not a fleet or an army. It was hatred. Across the province of Asia and beyond, resentment toward Roman rule had been building for years, against tax contractors, merchants, governors, creditors, and officials. That anger did not need much encouragement. It was ready to ignite, and Mithradates knew it. When a final attempt at negotiation failed, he struck first, launching the offensive in the spring of 88. The collapse of Roman authority was immediate. The Bithynian army broke first, its camp was taken, and the kingdom fell with stunning speed. Local militias scattered. One Roman detachment was crushed in Cappadocia. A governor fled toward the sea and safety. Another Roman commander was trapped in a city, surrendered, and paraded as a living trophy. Aquilius, stunned by how quickly the situation had reversed, tried to retreat, was caught, and was pushed from refuge to refuge until local populations handed him over. He was displayed through the towns as a public humiliation, the symbol of Roman arrogance dragged through streets that had once bowed to Roman orders. Stories grew around his end, some likely embellished, but the message was unmistakable. The Roman official who had forced the crisis was now being used as theatre for Rome's enemies. Mithradates followed victory with a policy designed to look generous and irresistible. Captured locals were released to spread the image of a liberator. Cities, sensing the wind shift, declared for him, many with enthusiasm. A few places resisted. Rhodes stood out as the most determined holdout, protected by its walls, its fleet, and a political instinct for survival. A handful of leagues and communities remained loyal to Rome as well, but they were the exceptions. For most of Asia, Rome's power had evaporated almost overnight, and with it, went ships, strongpoints, and the confidence of Roman supporters. Then came the event that transformed the war into something darker and more permanent. In 88, a coordinated massacre swept through the cities of Asia. Romans and Italians, men, women, and children were slaughtered in a single wave of violence. Sanctuaries were violated, debts were erased in blood, and property was divided between killers and the new regime. Later accounts varied wildly in numbers and detail, and it is likely that local vengeance and panic drove much of the brutality. Yet the reality of mass killing could not be hidden behind uncertainty. Whatever political advantage Mithradates hoped to gain by binding cities to him through shared guilt, the act carried a deadly cost. It destroyed any possibility of a quick settlement and hardened Roman opinion. In Italy, where factions had been tearing the state apart, the massacre gave many people something they could agree on. The enemy in the east had to be punished. While the province burned, Mithradates' naval forces moved west. During the winter of 88 and 87, his fleet pushed through the straits into the Aegean. With no Roman navy to oppose it, the sea became his highway. Islands were occupied in sequence, and the killings that had stained Asia spilled into new places. From Pergamum, now functioning as a command centre, Mithradates reorganized the conquered region, appointed governors, and distributed wealth seized from Roman property and local collaborators. That loot filled his treasury and allowed him to announce tax reductions, a move meant to present his rule as relief from Roman extraction. Drunk on success and convinced that Asia Minor was secured, he began to think beyond defence. The invasion of the Western world no longer looked impossible. Raids and disturbances had already shaken Macedonia and Epirus, and Greek cities watched the Roman crisis with mixed fear and excitement. Athens became the most symbolic prize. A local political upheaval opened the door for a Pontic-backed strongman to take control with a guard at his side. Opponents were killed or fled. The city and its port became a forward base for Mithradates in Europe. Across Greece, old frustrations found a new outlet. Roman dominance had been steady, predictable, and to many, humiliating. In that mood, even a foreign monarch could be welcomed as a liberator. Yet Greece was no longer a society capable of sustained resistance. Economic weakness and political decay drained the movement of unity and discipline. Many capable leaders stayed out of the revolt. Still, as Pontic forces appeared, several communities switched sides. A Roman officer with a small garrison fought hard to hold key points, recovered a few islands, and tried to relieve loyal cities. There were sharp clashes, including a tough 3-day struggle in Boeotia, but the Romans lacked numbers, ships, and secure supply lines. Gradually, they were pushed back. Pontic forces expanded their grip, establishing naval bases and bringing reinforcements in by sea. Control of the water meant control of the tempo of war. Mithradates could have used that advantage to do more. He could have attempted to send help to rebellious groups in Italy. But he did not. With Asia seemingly in his hands, he treated Italy's internal conflicts as useful noise rather than a cause worth serious resources. When Sulla finally landed on the coast of Epirus in the summer of 87, the situation was grim. Asia was lost. Much of Greece had defected. Macedonia was slipping away. He did not arrive with an overwhelming army. He arrived with 5 legions, roughly 30,000 men, and no fleet. Worse, he had little money, and he could not count on reliable support from Rome, where political enemies had declared him an outlaw and were preparing to replace him. He was attempting an imperial war while standing on a collapsing political floor. Yet his presence changed the balance immediately. Greek cities that had rushed toward Mithradates began to reconsider. Sulla demanded a return to the old situation and, when rejected, moved quickly into central Greece. He defeated Pontic forces in an early clash, and then turned toward Athens and its port, which were held by separate Pontic leaders. He secured his communications with carefully placed camps, and assigned trusted officers to guard key regions and corridors. Cities that had flirted with revolt now tried to buy safety with supplies, money, and manpower. The war had become a matter of survival, and loyalties shifted accordingly. The port fortress was hard to take without ships. Its defences were strong, its supplies could come by sea, and its commander knew how to conduct a professional defence. Sulla attempted assaults, fought bitter engagements, beat back relief efforts, and still could not seal the place off. To solve the naval problem, he sent an envoy across the eastern Mediterranean, seeking ships and alliances. The mission was dangerous and exhausting, and it met hesitation everywhere. Many states feared provoking Mithradates. Others doubted Rome's strength after so many humiliations. The search produced only limited results, and Sulla remained trapped on land while his enemy moved freely by water. He tried again to break the port by force, and the defenders responded by building successive inner walls, giving up ground only to reclaim it behind new fortifications. In the end, the port held. Sulla had to contain it, rather than capture it, leaving troops to watch it while turning to face a larger threat moving into Boeotia. Athens itself could not endure the same way. Cut off from steady supply, it weakened under hunger and disease. When the moment came, it fell to storm and sack. The leadership installed by Mithradates was captured and executed. Yet the city was not erased from the map. Its cultural prestige still mattered even to conquerors, and its political status was preserved more than its defenders expected. Sulla could be ruthless, but he understood symbolism. Even after taking Athens, his position remained dangerous. Key corridors into Greece were threatened. Some strategic towns had fallen. A year of war had drained manpower and resources. To pay the army and sustain operations, he seized sacred treasures, presenting the act as a loan to be repaid later. The gesture was practical and cynical at once. War required money, and in that moment, the gods' gold was available. Back in Rome, his political structure had already been torn apart, and a rival Roman commander was approaching, legally empowered to replace him. He still had no fleet worthy of the name. Victory on land did not automatically translate into control of the wider war. Then, Mithradates made a mistake. Rather than continue a patient strategy of delay, he ordered his large field army to advance into Boeotia, and he pulled the port commander out to join it. The force that marched was huge, impressive, and richly equipped, but it was also uneven. Different peoples, different training, different standards of discipline. Sulla, commanding a much smaller veteran army, pushed hard to force battle on ground that could limit the enemy's advantages. At Chaeronea, the contest turned into catastrophe for Mithridates' forces. Sulla shaped the field with trenches, earthworks, and barriers designed to neutralize cavalry and blunt the shock of war chariots. The chariot charge broke against fixed defences, and its disorder rippled backward into the infantry. Pontic cavalry tried to exploit gaps and turn Roman flanks, and for a time the battle swung across the line with real danger. But Sulla moved personally to crisis points, shifting forces, striking where the enemy was exposed, and using discipline to turn confusion into advantage. Once the Pontic infantry began to crack, retreat became panic. The enemy camp was taken. Survivors fled to strong points, still held by Mithridates. Sulla's own reports of Roman losses were predictably flattering, but the result was undeniable. A smaller army had shattered a larger one through preparation, cohesion, and ruthless timing. The victory did not end the war. Without ships, Sulla could not immediately harvest the full benefits. A Roman rival arrived with additional legions and tried to claim the war's glory by marching north and east instead of cooperating. His army soon mutinied, and he was killed, replaced by a brutal commander who nonetheless proved capable in the field. That new Roman force drove Mithradates out of key positions in Asia and nearly captured him. Internal Roman politics now threatened to sabotage Roman success, as commanders refused to support rivals even when it harmed the overall campaign. Mithradates attempted to recover by sending another massive army into Greece. Sulla met it again on the plains near Orchomenus. The fighting was savage and at moments uncertain. Pontic cavalry pressed hard, and Roman morale wavered under the weight of numbers. Sulla responded in the only way commanders like him did, by stepping into the danger himself, seizing a standard, and forcing the line forward through sheer example. The second defeat broke Mithridates' European position. Greece and Macedonia could be reoccupied, and Sulla finally gained breathing room to build ships and stabilize the region behind him. Meanwhile, Mithridates' empire began to rot from within. His demands for men and money grew heavier. Communities that had cheered him as a savior began to fear him as a predator. Some towns were stripped, others punished, local elites executed. Suspicion turned into a spiral of terror. Thousands died as plots were uncovered or invented. In desperation, he announced radical measures: debt cancellation, land redistribution, expanded freedom for dependent groups. Policies that looked like liberation, but often functioned as emergency tools to keep control. The result was not stability, but further disorder. The coalition he had assembled through fear and hope began to fray. On the sea, Roman fortunes improved. A small fleet was raised and used with skill to win fights and disrupt Pontic movement along the coast. Successes at sea tightened the pressure and helped secure the straits that connected Asia and Europe. At the same time, negotiations dragged on. Both sides had reasons to seek peace, and both tried to squeeze advantage out of delay. Mithridates understood Roman politics well enough to prefer dealing with Sulla directly, even though Sulla was officially condemned by the regime in Rome. Mithridates also attempted to use the existence of a rival Roman army as leverage. He tried bribery and bargaining, even hinting at cooperation against Sulla's political enemies. Sulla refused. Whatever else he was, in the presence of a foreign enemy, he could present himself as acting for Rome rather than for faction. The choices were harsh and often ugly, but they followed a clear logic. Sulla had no time to pursue total vengeance or a complete remaking of the East. Italy was unstable, and his political enemies had seized Rome. He needed money, ships, and a secure rear, not a long war of annihilation. So he ended the Eastern campaign with a settlement that protected Roman prestige, refilled Roman coffers, and freed his army to sail west. When the preparations were complete, his veterans, rested, paid, and confident, moved back through Greece and crossed to Italy. Only then did he formally report his actions to the Senate, as if nothing had happened in Rome, as if his deposition had been meaningless noise. He returned not as a fugitive commander, but as a man arriving with an army and the momentum of victory. Exactly the kind of force that now decided Roman politics. Sulla had barely left Italy when Rome slid back into violence. The country was exhausted, the economy still shaken, and the political system was no longer held together by habit or trust. The coalition that rose against Sulla's settlement did not resemble a disciplined party with a clear program. It was closer to an alliance of people who felt cheated, threatened, or angry, dispossessed politicians, frustrated financiers, Italians who believed their new rights were still being choked, and radicals who wanted revenge. At the centre of this unstable front stood Lucius Cornelius Cinna, elevated more by circumstance than by conviction. He was a competent soldier, not a visionary statesman, and his authority depended on stronger personalities around him, men who wanted power, payback, or both. The balance of force in Italy had shifted in an unsettling way. One of the Senate's most useful armies was effectively lost with the death of a key commander. Another powerful general, Pompeius Strabo, watched events with calculated caution, keeping his options open and offering loyalty only when it paid. Within Rome, hardline popular leaders demanded vengeance, while a separate faction pushed to recall men who had been exiled under earlier emergency measures. The business class was restless, still bruised by financial disruption. Many of the defeated communities from the social war remained bitter, and the Senate's refusal to fully satisfy the new citizens made the agitators' arguments more convincing and left armed resistance in parts of Italy, looking, to some, like the only language Rome understood. Cinna's first move was aimed at that raw nerve. He pushed to remove the practical restrictions that still limited the new citizens, and he supported the return of the Marian exiles. His colleague in office, Gnaeus Octavius, saw this as both a threat and an attempt to intimidate the assemblies by flooding Rome with Italian voters. He armed his supporters and prepared for confrontation. What followed was street war. Fighting tore through the Forum and into the surrounding lanes. The city became a battlefield for mobs and armed retainers, and the dead reportedly lay in the thousands. In the aftermath, the conservative side took an extraordinary step. Cinna was stripped of office and declared an enemy of the state. The act was legally dubious and politically disastrous. It allowed the conservatives to claim they were defending order, but it also gave their opponents a powerful narrative. An elected magistrate had been removed by force because he tried to deliver rights that had already been promised. The replacement chosen for him was a respectable but weak figure, the kind of man selected because he would not challenge anyone. That choice only revealed how uncertain the Senate truly was. Meanwhile, Cinna and his allies did not flee the country. They shifted the struggle onto a larger stage. They appealed directly to the new citizens, presenting themselves as defenders of equal rights, and they found eager recruits among communities that had learned, during the social war, how to raise armies quickly. Armed groups gathered from the Samnites and Lucanians, from veterans seeking plunder, and from runaways who understood that civil war could mean freedom. Cinna appeared before the Roman army besieging Nola, accompanied by the younger Marius and the highly capable Sertorius. The soldiers, not naturally loyal to conservative politics, recognized Cinna as the legitimate consul and began marching toward Rome with growing strength. At the same time, the old lion returned. Marius, invited back into the struggle, landed in Etruria with a small armed band that quickly expanded. His reputation still carried enormous weight, and public sentiment, part pity, part guilt, part fascination, helped him regain a following. He deliberately played the role of the persecuted hero, appearing in mourning and presenting himself as a man wronged by an arrogant elite. As he moved through the countryside, he released enslaved workers from rural detention farms, swelling his forces further. With ships gathered along the coast, he blocked supply routes, seized ports near the Tiber, and tightened a chokehold around Rome's western approaches. The city's lifeline, grain and traffic from the sea, began to fail. Inside Rome, the Senate tried to improvise defense. It armed citizens, fortified positions, and attempted to recruit new troops by extending citizenship concessions to communities that had surrendered late in the social war. The offer came too late to buy loyalty and too cautiously to inspire gratitude. Desperate leaders even opened talks with the Samnites, but the price demanded was impossible for Rome's ruling class to accept, without admitting defeat and humiliation. In the confusion, Strabo was called in as a last hope. He had the forces to disrupt the siege, and in one bloody clash he beat back Marius with help from Octavius. Yet Strabo's loyalty remained transactional. He allowed the ring around Rome to tighten rather than breaking it, calculating that every day of crisis increased his value. Soon, Rome was surrounded. Multiple armies closed in. The fall of key towns cut off potential relief from the north, and the Senate's remaining options shrank rapidly. Reports circulated that the franchise was finally equalized, that concessions were at last being made in full. But by then, the conflict had changed character. It was less about law and more about rage, fear, and survival. The one clear political motive left in the field was the old independent struggle of Samnium, now tied to a Roman civil war that offered the Samnites a chance to reshape Italy by force. Fighting under the walls became constant. The crowded city suffered famine and disease. The selfish commander who had helped create the crisis died in the epidemic, and his death sparked public fury rather than mourning. The defenders' morale collapsed. The only capable soldier left on the Senate's side found his efforts undermined by rigid, legalistic leadership that could not adapt. Desertions spread. Negotiations brought no real compromise, and eventually even the last holdouts recognized that the city could not hold. Cinna was restored, the formal outlawry was lifted, and Rome opened its gates without terms. Cinna gave a verbal assurance that no blood would be shed. Marius met it with silence. Once inside, he waited until the legal reversal was complete, and then he unleashed vengeance. For several days, killing and reprisals swept through Rome and then echoed across Italy. Prominent men were hunted down, senators, officials, wealthy figures, and those identified as enemies of the Marian cause. Some died in the streets, others by ordered execution, and a few chose suicide to avoid public humiliation. Bodies were left unburied, property was seized, and heads were displayed as warnings. Even the family of Sulla had to flee, and his property was destroyed or confiscated. The city that had once insisted it was governed by law now looked like a conquered place. In the aftermath, Marius and Cinna took the highest offices in a way that made their claims to popular legitimacy look hollow. Soon after securing the power he had chased for years, Marius died. His body was old, his health strained, and the final months of violence and indulgence hastened his end. His death closed one chapter but did not restore order by itself. For a brief time, Rome was ruled by men who had used terror as a political tool and now had to decide what to do with the state they had seized. The worst killing was eventually halted. Sertorius, more disciplined and more restrained than the hardliners around him, moved to break up armed bands that had turned murder into habit. A replacement consul was appointed, and the government tried to project stability. Sulla's earlier restrictions were quickly removed. Two major measures followed: a sweeping debt relief law that cancelled a large portion of what debtors owed, and the full integration of Italians into the voting tribes, finally carrying out what earlier reformers had demanded. This time, the administrative machinery was actually used to implement the change. In one sense, it was a real step toward inclusion. In another sense, it came wrapped in violence and fear, which poisoned the achievement. For the next years, Cinna remained the dominant figure. Italy was too exhausted for constant war, and many people accepted his rule simply because they dreaded another round of massacres. Provinces across the Roman world adjusted to the new reality. Some regions fell into line quickly. Others were secured through local rivalries. And the Marian leadership benefited from the fact that Sulla was occupied far away. Yet despite holding power, Cinna's government did not build a durable political system. It ruled day by day, improvising rather than reforming. It did not seriously reshape the constitution, did not create a stable, long-term settlement, and did not prepare the kind of professional military and naval defence that a renewed conflict would require. In that failure was a deeper truth. The so-called democratic movement still lacked a coherent plan for governing Rome. It could overthrow opponents, but it struggled to replace the old order with anything more functional. Then news arrived that Sulla had finished the Eastern War and intended to return. He offered a carefully chosen message: recognition of Italian voting equality and vengeance directed only at the leadership that had driven the revolution. Moderates within the Senate explored compromise, hoping to avoid another civil war by requiring Sulla to disband his army and return under safeguards. But the dominant Marian figures rejected the idea. They began large-scale preparations, assembling troops, many of them new citizens and veterans, on a scale that showed how widely fear of Sulla's return had spread. This was no longer a fringe faction. A large part of Italy, along with a Senate reshaped by killings and exile, expected retaliation and preferred war to surrender. Cinna attempted to move forces across the sea to confront Sulla before he reached Italy, but discipline broke. Soldiers feared the crossing and mutinied. In trying to restore order, Cinna was killed. Carbo, now the driving force, pulled back the forward troops and abandoned the plan to meet Sulla abroad. Winter passed under the shadow of the approaching storm. Sulla, for his part, responded with confidence. He insisted he needed no protection and offered guarantees instead to the Senate and his supporters. He demanded the return of exiles and made it clear that punishment would follow. Carbo pushed the machinery of the state to build a massive army and kept a tight grip on power, preventing an easy political transition. The consular leadership of the next year included men presented as moderate, but the coalition behind them was openly hostile to the reaction Sulla represented. Italy was bracing for another terror, and many believed it was inevitable. When Sulla landed at Brundisium, he arrived with a hardened army and a dangerous advantage: unity of command. Legally, he was an outlaw striking at the established government. Practically, he held the one instrument that now mattered most: veteran legions loyal to their general rather than to institutions. He understood that conquest required division among enemies. He issued proclamations offering amnesty to those who abandoned the Marian leaders, promised to respect the rights of the new citizens, insisted on strict discipline, and forced his troops to swear that Italians would be treated as Roman citizens, rather than enemies. It was a calculated performance of legality and restraint, designed to strip the government of support. The strategy worked quickly. Brundisium opened its gates, and much of the southeast submitted without fighting. The government's main forces were still concentrated far to the north, leaving the southern coast exposed. Support began to gather around Sulla. Experienced commanders who had been driven out returned to his camp. Wealthy men who had escaped earlier violence came back seeking revenge and restoration. Political opportunists shifted sides at the right moment. Most important of all was a young, ambitious commander from Picenum, Gnaeus Pompeius, son of Strabo. He had served under the Marian regime and had survived legal and political attacks at home, but he moved decisively once he saw the direction of events. He raised several legions from personal networks, tenants, clients, veterans, and defeated the forces sent to stop him. When he joined Sulla, he did so not as a minor ally but as a rising power, earning public praise and the title that marked him as a commander in his own right. Sulla marched into Campania and met the government's aggressive consul, Norbanus. The clash ended in a clear Sullan victory, and Norbanus was driven into Capua. Another government army under Scipio advanced along the Appian Road, but instead of forcing a decisive fight, Scipio entered into negotiations. In the pause, discipline collapsed. His troops mingled with Sulla's men, fraternized, and then refused to fight. Whole units crossed over. Sulla made a point of dismissing many officers unharmed, a gesture that looked merciful, but also served a cold purpose. It encouraged more desertions and spread the belief that resistance was pointless. Winter followed, with both sides preparing for a final struggle. The Marian leadership in Rome embraced a no-compromise policy. Outlaw decrees were issued against Sulla's supporters. Levies were raised in huge numbers, especially among veterans tied to the Marian name. Samnites and Lucanians prepared to join the fight in force, not merely as auxiliaries, but as national enemies who saw the coming war as a chance to settle the old Italian struggle. The conflict was becoming more than a contest for offices. It was turning into a fight between Rome's dominance and the survival of peoples who had resisted Rome for generations. The next year opened with Sulla moving straight toward Rome while the younger Marius tried to shield the capital. Metellus faced Carbo in the north, where control of routes and recruitment bases mattered as much as battlefield victories. At Sacriportus, Sulla struck Marius as he withdrew toward the fortress city of Praeneste and drove him back into its walls. Praeneste became the centre of the war. Its defences were strong enough to hold out for a long siege, and as long as Marius remained inside, the Marian cause had a living symbol. Rome itself was evacuated by a Marian commander who, before leaving, carried out another round of killings against remaining opponents. Sulla entered the city briefly, not to celebrate, but to seize administrative control and use the appearance of legality against enemies. Then, he moved again toward the north to coordinate with allies against Carbo. In the northern campaign, movement and timing mattered. Carbo tried to manage multiple fronts at once, holding Gaul and Etruria, while also supporting Praeneste. Sulla's side struck from different directions. Metellus advanced into the Po region and cut vital connections. A legate pressed toward key river towns. Pompeius and Crassus advanced through Umbria, harassing marches and blocking relief columns. A major battle near Clusium did not produce a clean decision, but it slowed Carbo long enough for Sulla's allies to break Marian attempts to relieve Praeneste. Repeated relief efforts were defeated. Meanwhile, Norbanus, after some success, suffered a crushing defeat that triggered a broader collapse. Desertions increased, allied contingents switched sides, commanders betrayed each other, and the northern Marian army disintegrated. Norbanus fled overseas and avoided capture only through suicide. Carbo, facing pressure from multiple directions, attempted one more desperate maneuver by sending troops to delay Sulla near Praeneste. When that failed, he abandoned Italy and escaped to Africa. What remained of his forces moved toward Praeneste in a last attempt to free the younger Marius. At the same moment, a large Samnite and Lucanian army surged up from the south with the same objective, reinforced by troops from Capua. Their leaders understood that if Sulla won, the punishment of their peoples could be absolute. They marched not only to save an ally, but to save themselves. With sudden determination, the insurgent army broke camp and advanced at speed along the Latin road. Sulla, learning of the move, reacted with alarm and set out in pursuit by forced marches. It became a race toward the city, a contest decided as much by endurance as by strategy. The rebels reached the Colline gate first, brushing aside a small body of volunteers who had rushed out from Rome. They established their camp close to the walls and prepared for an immediate assault. Around midday, Sulla's cavalry arrived, followed by the exhausted infantry. Ignoring the advice of his officers, he gave his men little time for rest and hurled them straight into battle. The struggle that began on the first day of November was the most savage Rome had ever witnessed. Fighting continued from late afternoon deep into the night. On the left wing, the Samnite warriors, driven by centuries of hatred, pressed Sulla's veterans back toward the very walls of the city. The commander fought like an ordinary soldier, at moments barely escaping death. The Roman line bent until the closed gates forced the men to turn and stand again. As darkness fell, the result was uncertain, and Sulla himself feared that all was lost. Only later in the night did word arrive that Crassus, commanding the right wing, had shattered the enemy opposite him. At dawn, the Samnite host began to withdraw, and when a body of deserters turned their weapons against their former comrades, the retreat became a massacre. No mercy followed victory. The Samnite forces were hunted down and almost annihilated. Prisoners, including those who had changed sides, were executed in great numbers within earshot of the Senate, which had been summoned to hear Sulla speak. He calmly assured the frightened senators that the noise outside came merely from criminals receiving punishment. The next days brought the fall of Praeneste. The younger Marius chose suicide rather than capture, and the defenders, soldiers and townspeople alike, were cut down without distinction. One of Rome's oldest allies was virtually erased from the map. Resistance elsewhere collapsed more slowly, but just as cruelly. Town after town surrendered or was stormed. The lands of the Samnites and many Etruscan communities were devastated. Their populations scattered. Their walls levelled. Some places, such as Nola and Volaterrae, endured long sieges, yet the outcome was never in doubt. Across Italy, sullen garrisons imposed order, and the remnants of rebellion were extinguished one by one. In the provinces, the news produced swift submissions. Sardinia yielded, Gaul returned to obedience, and Sicily was abandoned by its Marian commander when Pompey arrived with a powerful fleet. That young general carried the war to Africa, defeated the remaining opponents there, restored the friendly Numidian king, and secured the continent in little more than a month. His success won him the unprecedented honour of a triumph and the proud title that would follow him for life. Only in Spain did the opposition survive. Sertorius, the most capable of the Marian leaders, withdrew rather than fight a hopeless battle, leaving the stage temporarily to Sulla. In the east, a minor conflict flared when a Roman governor seeking glory provoked Mithradates once more. But the king quickly repelled him, and peace was restored. Everywhere else, the new order prevailed. The democracy lay shattered, its allies destroyed, and Rome itself, saved at the Colline gate, awaited the hand of a master who would reshape the state. Sulla now faced the task he had promised, to reward supporters, punish enemies, and secure senatorial rule. The days of compromise were over. The earlier attempt at moderation had failed, and the stubborn resistance of his foes convinced him that only ruthless measures could clear the ground for reconstruction. He did not act from mere personal rage, though revenge played its part. In his mind, the survival of the Republic required the eradication of those who had challenged it. Executions began at once. First as chaotic killings, and then through a more formal mechanism. Lists of the condemned were posted, naming men whose lives and property were forfeit. The uncertainty of the early days encouraged private vendettas, until Sulla, accepted responsibility by publishing official registers. Even so, the system was abused. Informers enriched themselves, debts were cancelled through murder, and many died for reasons unrelated to politics. The sons and grandsons of the proscribed were barred from public life, and their estates were sold at auction. The equestrian order, which had profited from earlier revolutions, now suffered most severely. The memory of Marius was desecrated, his monuments destroyed, his remains scattered. Confiscations transformed Italian society. Vast tracts of land were taken from defeated communities and redistributed to Sulla's veterans, nearly 120,000 of them. These settlements were intended as a loyal garrison for the restored Senate. Yet many soldiers soon sold their allotments and drifted into idleness, adding to the instability they were meant to prevent. The displaced inhabitants reduced to poverty swelled the ranks of bandits and exiles. Sulla's centralizing vision swept away local traditions, but it left behind empty fields and bitter memories. To give legal shape to his actions, Sulla accepted an extraordinary dictatorship. The office granted him unlimited authority to remake the laws and reorganize the republic. Though clothed in republican forms, his power was essentially monarchic. He used it, however, to strengthen the Senate rather than to establish personal rule. The popular assemblies were restricted, the tribunate stripped of initiative, and legislation made dependent on senatorial approval. The number of magistrates was increased to manage the growing empire, yet military commands were separated from civil officers to prevent another general from imitating Sulla's own march on Rome. The courts were overhauled, new permanent tribunals created, and senators restored as jurors in place of the equestrian class. Financial reforms abolished the grain dole and reclaimed public lands. Through these measures, Sulla hoped to secure a stable aristocratic government, guarded from both mob and military adventurer. His system was orderly and consistent, but it relied on fear rather than consent. Having completed his work, Sulla did what few expected. He resigned. In a public assembly, he laid down his powers, dismissed his guards, and returned to private life. The act astonished Rome, yet it followed the logic of his beliefs. He wished the constitution to stand without him, not to depend on a permanent strongman. Retiring to his estate near the coast, he spent his last months writing memoirs and enjoying the pleasures he had long postponed. He died the following year, confident that his creation would endure. The collapse of the Lepidan revolt left Pompey free to seek new glory beyond Italy, and the Senate, though uneasy at his growing power, had little choice but to employ him. Sertorius still dominated much of Spain, and no established commander was willing to confront that brilliant and elusive opponent. Pompey pressed his claims with barely concealed threats, and the senators reluctantly granted him proconsular authority in the eastern provinces of the peninsula, a command irregular in law but unavoidable in practice. His first season was spent securing southern Gaul, where Sertorian agents had stirred unrest, and during this delay, the rebel leader tightened his grip on the nearer Spanish districts. The following year, the struggle became more serious. Metellus, operating from Baetica, defeated Sertorius's lieutenant Hirtuleius near Italica, while Pompey crossed the Ebro and captured Valentia after overcoming several subordinate commanders. Yet when Sertorius himself appeared, the balance changed at once. The veteran Roman renegade, master of irregular warfare, outmaneuvered Pompey and seized Lauro almost under the eyes of the relief force. In the next campaign, Metellus crushed Hirtuleius, again at Segovia, and marched to join his younger colleague. Pompey, eager for independent credit, risked battle on the river Sucro before the junction could be completed, and was saved from ruin only by Metellus's timely arrival. Sertorius mocked his opponent, saying that without the old woman, he would have driven the youth back to Rome. A further engagement brought no decisive result, and the Spanish levies gradually melted away, leaving Sertorius to conduct a stubborn guerrilla resistance from his strongholds along the Ebro. As the war dragged on, the rebel leader searched for allies beyond Spain. He negotiated with the pirates who infested the Mediterranean and even with Mithradates in the east. Yet he refused to sacrifice Roman territory for foreign support. These desperate measures only deepened suspicion among his own followers. Many Spanish chiefs resented the execution of their sons held as hostages at Osca, and Roman officers in his service feared his stern discipline. At last, a conspiracy formed within his headquarters, and Sertorius, the ablest opponent Rome had faced since Hannibal, was murdered at a banquet by men who owed him everything. His successor, Perperna, lacked both talent and authority. Pompey defeated him at the first encounter, captured him, and burned the papers he tried to use as a bribe, choosing prudence over vengeance. While Spain was being pacified, a new danger erupted in Italy itself. In the gladiatorial school at Capua, a Thracian named Spartacus, together with 2 Gallic companions, led a breakout that quickly swelled into a massive slave rebellion. The fugitives seized Mount Vesuvius and defeated the militia sent to contain them. Moving into Lucania, they crushed successive Roman detachments and drew to their ranks the shepherd slaves of the southern plains. For a time, the countryside lay at their mercy and several towns were stormed. Spartacus hoped to cross the Alps and disperse his followers to their homelands. But the undisciplined bands preferred plunder to freedom. Their delay allowed Marcus Crassus to organize 8 legions and impose brutal discipline on the wavering recruits. Crassus drove the insurgents into the toe of Italy and tried to seal them there with fortifications. Spartacus broke through and reappeared in Lucania, still dangerous, but internal divisions weakened his army. A Gallic detachment was destroyed, and in Apulia the final battle was forced against the advice of their leader. Spartacus fell fighting, and the remnants were hunted down or crucified along the roads. Pompey, returning from Spain, intercepted a fleeing group and claimed the honour of ending the war, a boast that deepened the rivalry between the 2 commanders. Both generals now stood outside Rome with loyal armies, and the political balance shifted at once. Reformers demanded the restoration of the tribunes' powers and the cleansing of the Senate courts. Pompey needed popular support for land grants to his veterans and for future commands. Crassus, wealthy but less celebrated, could not oppose him alone. The 2 rivals reached an uneasy agreement, adopted the democratic program, and secured the consulship for the year 70. The tribunate was revived, the censors once more reviewed the Senate, and the juries were shared between senators, knights, and a third class of citizens. The system created by Sulla crumbled within a decade, not through ideology but through the ambitions of soldiers. Yet Pompey refused to seize permanent power. Pressed by Crassus to disband their forces together, he chose legality over dictatorship and retired from public life, awaiting a call worthy of his reputation. That call came swiftly from the sea. The Mediterranean had fallen under the control of organized pirate fleets that raided coasts, captured officials, and strangled the grain trade. Earlier attempts to suppress them had failed, and famine threatened the capital itself. A tribune proposed granting Pompey extraordinary authority over all waters and coastal regions, with vast resources and the right to appoint numerous deputies. Despite senatorial protests, the people insisted on their champion. Pompey acted with remarkable speed. Dividing the Mediterranean into sectors, he drove the corsairs from the western seas in little more than a month and then struck eastward. A decisive battle off the Cilician coast broke their power, and generous terms encouraged mass surrender. In 3 months, the terror of generations was ended, and the former pirates were resettled in new communities under Roman supervision. The success seemed almost miraculous, and prepared the way for an even greater command. At that moment, the war against Mithradates had reached a dangerous stalemate. Lucullus had won brilliant victories but alienated his soldiers and offended powerful interests at Rome. A new law transferred the entire eastern command to Pompey. He secured an alliance with Parthia, gathered a large army, and advanced into Pontus. After a hard campaign, he trapped Mithradates and shattered his forces in a night battle near the Euphrates. The king fled to Armenia, but Tigranes, fearing Roman wrath, submitted and accepted reduced dominion. The Caucasian tribes were beaten, and Mithradates, isolated in the Bosporus, eventually perished by his own hand when his last followers rebelled. Pompey then turned to the reordering of the east. Syria was reduced to a province, and the island of Crete and the combined lands of Bithynia and Pontus were organized under Roman governors. The interior was left to dependent monarchs who guarded the frontiers, while numerous cities were founded or refounded to spread Greek civic life. Pirates were settled as farmers, veterans planted in strategic towns, and trade routes reopened. In Judea, he intervened in a bitter civil struggle, captured Jerusalem after a hard siege, and transformed the Hasmonean kingdom into a client state under its high priest. The settlement brought stability unknown for decades. Commerce revived, the provinces gained orderly administration, and the prestige of Rome stood higher than ever. Yet one unresolved issue remained: the frontier with Parthia. Pompey avoided open war, but left tensions smouldering along the Euphrates, a hesitation that would later cost the Republic dearly. For the moment, however, he returned to the west, acclaimed as the restorer of peace on land and sea. The man who had crushed pirates, humbled kings, and reshaped the Eastern world. The part later called the Catilinarian conspiracy remains one of the most tangled and disputed chapters of Roman history. What survives is a mixture of political propaganda, courtroom rhetoric, and personal memoir, all shaped by the interests of those who emerged victorious. Stripped of exaggeration, the affair reveals less a coherent revolutionary movement than a confused collision of ambitions, fears, and social tensions. Its lasting importance lies not in the shadowy plans of Cataline himself, but in the way the crisis allowed Marcus Cicero to present himself as the saviour of the Republic, and in the glimpse it offers of the manoeuvres of figures such as Caesar and Crassus, as they positioned themselves for the return of Pompey. With Pompey campaigning in the distant east, Rome appeared for a moment to belong again to civilian politics. Old party labels resurfaced, lawsuits multiplied, and the Forum echoed with familiar arguments. Yet the traditional conflict between popular leaders and senatorial conservatives had lost real meaning. Everyone understood that the ultimate decision rested with the absent general commanding Asia. No orator, not even Cicero, could rival the authority of Pompey's legions. Beneath the noisy debates ran a current of intrigue as both factions tried to prepare for his return, fearing that he might imitate Sulla and impose a new dictatorship while hoping to bend his prestige to their own purposes. The so-called Popular Party was itself a loose gathering of malcontents, rather than an organised force. Alongside a few sincere reformers stood bankrupt nobles, disappointed office seekers, and men ruined by debt or scandal. The Senate, by contrast, possessed at least a clear objective: the preservation of its dominance and the avoidance of any excuse for military intervention. Within its ranks there were divisions between uncompromising conservatives and moderates, led, almost reluctantly, by Cicero. The real struggle was not between democracy and oligarchy, but between rival groups attempting to shape the environment in which Pompey would re-enter Italian politics. At the centre of the storm stood Lucius Sergius Catilina, a patrician whose life embodied the darker side of the Sullan generation. Courageous, charismatic, and physically formidable, he was also burdened with debts, stained by violence, and accustomed to the brutal shortcuts of the civil wars. Supporters admired his energy. Enemies portrayed him as a monster of corruption. Whatever the truth, he attracted a following drawn from the disaffected. Veterans who had squandered their allotments, dispossessed farmers, ruined gamblers, and young aristocrats eager for quick advancement. Italy contained ample combustible material, particularly in Etruria and among the descendants of those proscribed years earlier. Rumours of earlier plots circulated even before the main crisis. After the elections of 66, 2 candidates unseated for bribery were said to have considered murdering their successful rivals. Later, writers linked Caesar and Crassus to this shadowy scheme, claiming they hoped to use Cataline as an instrument for a broader coup. The stories rest on hostile pamphlets and the fevered imagination of political enemies. Yet they show how deeply contemporaries suspected the ambitions of the democratic leaders. Crassus, serving as censor in 65, attempted bold initiatives that hinted at wider designs. He proposed turning Egypt into a Roman province and granting citizenship to the communities beyond the Po, measures that would have strengthened Caesar's position and provided resources independent of Pompey. Conservative resistance blocked both plans, but the issues remained alive and ensured sympathy for Cataline in northern Italy. The consular elections of 64 became a decisive battle. 5 candidates competed, but the real contest lay between Cataline and Cicero. The former relied on the financial backing of restless nobles, and on the hope of intimidating the vote. The latter represented a coalition of moderates, businessmen, and Italian municipals alarmed by the spectre of disorder. Cicero's oratory, his reputation from the prosecution of corrupt governors, and the quiet support of Pompey's friends carried the day. He topped the poll, while Cataline was narrowly defeated by Gaius Antonius, a man whose loyalty could be purchased. Cicero entered office determined to defend constitutional order. He imagined a broad alliance of respectable citizens, with Pompey as its guardian and himself as its guiding voice. Yet the alliance was fragile. Senators feared the knights distrusted the Senate, and Italy remained politically unorganized. Caesar, blocked in larger schemes, turned to more direct challenges, reviving memories of Marius and attacking the legality of emergency decrees. His election as chief priest, one against powerful aristocrats, showed how far popular sentiment could still be mobilized. Cataline, undeterred, prepared one last attempt on the consulship. When this failed, he shifted from intrigue to open rebellion. In Etruria, an old centurion gathered armed supporters, while in Rome, plans were discussed for coordinated violence. Cicero, informed by a network of informers, forced the issue. In a dramatic session of the Senate, he denounced Cataline to his face, driving him from the city to join the insurgents. The Senate declared the leaders public enemies and entrusted military action to Antonius, whose reliability remained doubtful. The conspiracy within Rome soon collapsed through its own clumsiness. Lentulus, the highest-ranking participant, sought support from Gallic envoys who instead revealed the plot to Cicero. Written evidence was secured, and the principal suspects were arrested. Confronted with their own seals and testimonies, they confessed before the Senate. Public opinion swung decisively toward the government, convinced that massacre and arson had been averted. Fear, more than evidence, pushed Rome's leaders toward a choice that would haunt them for years. After the arrests, the city's mood shifted from alarm to something sharper, a demand for immediate punishment. On the 5th of December, the consul brought the Senate together to decide what should be done with the prisoners. In a calculated move, their custody had been distributed among prominent men from different political camps, including figures associated with the popular leaders, so that responsibility for the outcome would be shared, and no single faction could claim clean hands later. The debate opened with a strong current in one direction. Speaker after speaker leaned toward the harshest solution, and the consul-elect Silanus was among those urging death as the only safe course. Then Caesar intervened, and the atmosphere changed. He did not present himself as the protector of the conspirators, nor did he plead for mercy. Instead, he argued for a severe punishment that still preserved the principle that a Roman citizen should not be killed without a formal legal process. His position was framed as constitutional rather than sentimental, and he delivered it with a mixture of public calm and an implied warning. If the state crossed certain lines in the name of safety, it would plant seeds of retaliation. The words were measured, but the suggestion was unmistakable. Today's emergency could become tomorrow's precedent, and those who supported violence might one day answer for it. The effect was immediate. Silanus began to hedge. Older statesmen who had seemed confident moments before started to hesitate. Some proposed delaying the decision, not because the danger had vanished, but because they sensed the risk of executing men who had not been tried by the people. The consul pressed for a clear verdict, anxious not to let the moment slip and not to allow any turn in public mood or any rescue attempt to complicate the situation. For a time, the meeting drifted toward postponement, until another voice cut through the uncertainty. Cato, younger than many of the men wavering around him, spoke with blunt force. He treated Caesar's argument not as a noble defense of rights, but as an invitation to paralysis. He insisted that the prisoners were not ordinary defendants, but enemies caught in active treason, and that the state had the right to act swiftly against those who had moved from politics into war. He countered the warnings with a warning of his own. Hesitation would be read as weakness, and weakness would invite further violence. He framed the issue as one of survival and honour, and he shamed the doubters into choosing a line they could defend to the public. Once the debate was forced onto those terms, a convenient Roman distinction did the rest. The prisoners could be treated as public enemies, rather than citizens in the ordinary sense, and that formula eased the consciences of men who wanted both safety and a legal excuse. The vote went heavily in favour of immediate execution, and the decision was carried out without delay. The consul personally escorted the condemned to the state prison near the Capitoline Hill. There, out of sight, they were strangled one by one. When the deed was done, he returned to the crowd and spoke a single word that signalled the end. The city took it as a deliverance. In the streets, fear turned into applause, and for a moment the government looked strong. Yet the swiftness of the act revealed a deeper weakness. The executions were not backed by a proper public trial, and the Senate's decision itself did not have the force of law in the way later generations would like to imagine. Rome's political tradition had long insisted on the right of appeal in capital cases, and the choice to bypass that tradition amounted to an admission that the authorities did not trust their own institutions to hold firm for even a short time. The only serious defence of the decision was the claim that the crisis was so urgent that ordinary procedures could not be used. But that claim sat awkwardly beside the reality of the rebellion outside the city, which was poorly organised and largely made up of desperate men with limited arms and limited discipline. While the prisoners died in Rome, Cataline faced a different end. His cause was collapsing even as he tried to give it shape. He had raised a force that might have numbered around 10,000 at its height, a mixed crowd bound more by debt and anger than by clear political goals. When news spread that the leaders in the capital had been seized and eliminated, many followers slipped away. What remained was pushed into a narrowing space. Near Pistoia, Cataline found himself with roughly 6,000 men, hemmed in by two Roman forces. One blocked the route north toward Gaul, the other pressed behind him. Cut off and unable to retreat, he chose to fight. Antonius, the consul who had been assigned the task of suppression, avoided leading the final battle in person. Whether from illness, calculation, or an unwillingness to slaughter men who had once been close to his political circle, he handed command to his subordinate Petreius. The clash that followed was brutal and direct. Neither side offered quarter and neither expected it. Petreius drove hard at the centre, breaking the rebel line and deciding the outcome. Cataline fought with the stubborn courage of a man who knew he had no pardon waiting. He died in the melee, and many of his supporters fell where they stood, forming a grim pattern of bodies that later observers would point to as proof that, whatever their crimes, they did not run. In the aftermath, the whole affair remained difficult to measure. The story that later generations inherited was shaped by speeches, political memoirs, and the need of victors to justify extreme actions. The danger may have been inflated, the plans attributed to the conspirators may have grown darker in retelling, and the villainy of Cataline may have been painted in exaggerated tones. What seems more solid is the basic outline. An embittered aristocrat, blocked from office and drowning in debt, tried to seize power by force, appealing to a reservoir of social resentment that had been building since the civil wars. He possessed daring and personal magnetism, but lacked the patient organization that turns discontent into a disciplined movement. That limitation, more than the brilliance of his enemies, explains why his attempt collapsed so quickly once the state acted decisively. For Cicero, the outcome was politically priceless. The failure of the Rising allowed him to claim the role of protector of the community, and the panic of the moment pushed property holders, financiers, and moderate citizens into the government's camp. At the same time, the episode damaged the broader reform movement. Even those not involved were suspected because the boundary between ambitious reformers and reckless agitators had become easy to blur in the public mind. Cicero did not press the advantage to the point of trying to drag Caesar and Crassus into the net, and that restraint was strategic as much as principled. It was enough that their circle was stained by suspicion and that their momentum was checked. The lawyer from a small Italian town had defeated men who imagined themselves capable of standing against the returning conqueror. And that conqueror was already on his way. Pompey's victories in the east had brought him honours that bordered on royal, and in Italy many believed the existing system had discredited itself beyond repair. Between the Senate's weakness and the cynicism of street politics, the old republican balance looked less like a working constitution and more like a stage set that could collapse at the next shock. In that climate, the public increasingly saw only two alternatives: the order imposed by a single dominant figure, or the chaos of competing factions. Pompey's supporters moved early to shape events in Rome before he arrived. Metellus Nepos reached the city in time to win the tribunate, and to argue that Pompey should be given authority to finish off the remnants of Catiline's revolt and then return to office at the highest level. His enemies in the Senate resisted, not because they trusted the Republic's stability, but because they feared the growth of Pompey's prestige and resented his dominance. Their opposition drove Nepos into cooperation with the popular leaders, a shift that revealed how quickly old alignments could be rearranged when power was at stake. Caesar reacted with his usual speed. At the beginning of his praetorship, he proposed transferring a symbolic honour from a leading aristocrat to Pompey, a gesture designed to widen the split between Pompey and the conservative bloc. He also backed Nepos when the tribune tried to silence Cicero in public, arguing that a man who had approved executions without a popular trial had forfeited the right to celebrate himself before the people. When Nepos pushed a bill that would have given Pompey a command in Italy, the conflict spilled into open disorder. Cato blocked the proposal, the meeting dissolved in uproar, and the Senate responded with an emergency declaration and the suspension of Caesar and Nepos from office. Nepos withdrew to Pompey's camp, while Caesar stayed in Rome, waiting until the Senate stepped back from its most aggressive measures. Then Pompey landed in Italy, and the moment that many feared did not arrive. He dismissed his veterans instead of marching them toward Rome. The choice looked like loyalty, even restraint, and it was meant to signal that he did not intend to seize power by force. He preferred a different kind of dominance: influence without office, authority supported by reputation rather than by armed intimidation. Yet the same qualities that had made him a careful commander left him ineffective as a political operator. He lacked the flexibility and persuasive talent required to manage Rome's factions, and he relied on agents who often misjudged the city's mood. His first attempts to set an agenda disappointed those who had expected decisive leadership, and within a year of his triumphant return he found himself isolated and surprisingly vulnerable to small, organised opposition. As Pompey struggled to find his footing, Rome's conflicts played out in the courts. The trial of Clodius, accused of violating a women-only religious rite by entering a forbidden gathering in disguise, became a public spectacle. The charge was sacrilege, but the case carried political meaning because it touched Caesar's household and because Cicero's testimony helped break Clodius's defence. Even so, bribery and pressure secured an acquittal. Caesar chose not to pursue the matter openly, but he ended his marriage, insisting that his household must stand beyond suspicion. The episode damaged the standing of the aristocratic leadership, exposed the corruption of juries, and hardened Clodius's hostility towards Cicero. Caesar soon left for Spain after financial backing helped him escape the net of creditors, and there he gained military practice and administrative reputation. Back in Rome, the Senate made a series of miscalculations that pushed Pompey toward a new alignment. The senators refused to ratify Pompey's eastern settlement in one clear decision, stalled on land grants promised to his veterans, and discouraged his hopes for renewed high office. At the same time, they alienated the business class by refusing to revise tax contracts in Asia that had turned out disastrously expensive for the contractors. With the alliance between senators and financiers broken, the political centre that Cicero had tried to build dissolved. Pompey tried to appeal directly to the people, even supporting popular measures that reduced burdens on Italian trade. Yet when it came to the concrete demand of land for veterans, his supporters failed to overcome senatorial resistance, and proposed legislation was weakened and abandoned. The great general, who had reshaped the East, could not even secure the rewards he had promised to his own soldiers. When Caesar returned from Spain, he recognized the opening. Pompey was frustrated and cornered. Crassus had wealth and a powerful network. Caesar had ambition and a clearer sense of how to turn Roman institutions into instruments. He surrendered the immediate glory of a triumph in order to stand for the consulship without delay, then arranged a private compact with Pompey and Crassus. Each partner would receive something essential. Pompey would get confirmation of his eastern decisions and land for his veterans. Crassus would see relief for the tax contractors. Caesar would gain the consulship and, more importantly, a major provincial command with troops. The coalition worked. Caesar won office with an aristocratic colleague, Bibulus, chosen largely to obstruct him. Caesar first presented his measures to the Senate in a traditional way, offering to purchase land with funds derived from eastern revenues and distribute it to veterans and poorer citizens to validate Pompey's eastern arrangements and to ease the burden of the Asian tax contracts. The Senate refused to cooperate, relying on delay and denial rather than debate. That refusal allowed Caesar to shift the struggle to the popular assembly. The procedure was legal but dangerous because it turned complex policy into a single yes or no vote without meaningful amendment. Caesar accepted the risk and forced the measures through despite vetoes and despite Bibulus's attempts to block public business by invoking religious objections. Bibulus was driven from the forum, retreated into self-imposed isolation, and spent the year issuing angry statements that had little practical effect. The land program expanded to include valuable state-owned territory and the establishment of a colony at Capua, and senators were compelled to swear acceptance of the law, at least for the time being. Pompey's eastern settlement was then confirmed, and the alliance was tightened by family connection when Pompey married Caesar's daughter, Julia. Crassus's gain was less glorious but financially significant, since the tax contractors received partial remission, a concession that looked like political payment at the expense of strict public integrity. Caesar also advanced legislation intended to curb provincial exploitation. It targeted the tricks that governors and their entourages used to extract money, banned illegal levies and gifts, and imposed heavy penalties, including restitution and exclusion from public life, with harsher consequences reserved for serious offenders. Yet alongside this stood a more cynical act. Rome's long hesitation over Egypt ended, for the moment, not through policy clarity, but through a payment that secured recognition of the reigning king. None of Caesar's work would have mattered without troops. An attempt by the Senate to assign harmless duties to the outgoing consuls failed, and a vote granted Caesar a powerful command in northern Italy and the Adriatic region for 5 years with several legions. Further unrest beyond the Alps led to the addition of another province and another legion. With that decision, Caesar gained what ambitious Romans needed above everything: a long command, an army, and a base close enough to Italy to keep one eye on Rome while expanding Roman power in the west. Before leaving, Caesar ensured that the coalition's most articulate opponent would be neutralized. Cicero refused offers that would have tied him to the new arrangement. He would not accept a place on a land commission or a position under Caesar, because he wanted to remain independent and continue presenting himself as defender of the old order. Since persuasion failed, pressure replaced it. Clodius, now backed by powerful patrons and driven by personal hatred, reshaped his status through legal maneuvering to become eligible for the tribunate. Once in office, he enacted popular measures that won the urban crowd, including free grain and limits on certain traditional controls used by magistrates. He also rebuilt street organizations that could function as a kind of political militia. Then he struck at Cicero with a law phrased in general terms. Any man who had executed a citizen without a public trial would be banished. The target was obvious, and Cicero's past decisions now became a weapon against him. His supporters appealed to sympathy and to the memory of his services, but Clodius controlled the streets and boasted that he acted with the quiet approval of the triumvirs. Cicero, unwilling to fight a violent battle in the city, fled after a final appeal to Pompey. The measure passed as he left, and his departure was treated as proof of guilt. Beyond the Alps, Rome already possessed a strip of territory that many in the capital called Gaul, but it was only a corner of a far larger world. The northern edge of this Roman zone leaned on the Rhone as it ran from the region of Geneva down toward Vienne. To To the west, rugged highlands and a few strong points guarded the approaches, while the great coastal highway towards Spain was anchored by Narbo Martius, a colony planted to secure the road and the sea route. Along the Mediterranean shore, Massilia stood as Rome's most important Greek partner. Long before it accepted Roman protection, that city had acted as a cultural bridge, spreading literacy, coinage, and Mediterranean farming habits, such as vine and olive cultivation, into the surrounding countryside. By the time Caesar arrived, the region hummed with outsiders, merchants chasing profit, financiers looking for interest, graziers and farmers treating the land as an investment. Local customs and language were already under pressure from this steady tide of settlement and commerce. Yet Caesar's interest did not stop at the borders he had been assigned. This southern province offered a glimpse of what the wider land might become if it were drawn into Rome's orbit. It was fertile, strategically placed, and close enough to Italy to matter immediately. But Caesar looked outward, imagining the whole sweep from the Pyrenees to the Rhine as a space that could be brought under Roman influence. He also sensed that the Celtic world did not end at the rivers and mountains of Gaul. The same peoples and related cultures stretched into Britain and had long interacted with northern Italy. In his view, the southern province was not the destination. It was a foothold. The society he encountered in Gaul sat in an uneasy middle position, no longer purely barbarian, not yet fully shaped into the urban, bureaucratic style Rome understood as civilization. Farming existed, but pastoral wealth carried higher prestige. Horses and cattle mattered as much as grain. The people could mine and work metal, and they produced coins of their own, but the imagery often echoed Greek models in distorted forms, and their ornamentation leaned toward bold, unfamiliar patterns rather than classical restraint. This mixture suggested a society absorbing outside influence without becoming a copy of the Mediterranean world. Politics showed the same half-formed character. In many places, the clan remained the true foundation of power. Even where fortified towns existed, city life had not replaced older tribal bonds. In the north, traditional structures still survived in recognizable shapes. A leading figure, councils of elders, assemblies of free men. In the south, however, wealthy aristocrats had pushed aside older kingship and hollowed out popular authority. These nobles gathered armed followers, built influence through marriage networks, and often acted above law, strong enough to ignore institutions that existed on paper. Yet the same aristocratic dominance that weakened individual tribes also encouraged larger alliances, since rival noble groups needed partners and clients to compete. Alongside them stood another force that was even more visibly pan-Gallic: the priestly order commonly known as the Druids. Their influence reached across tribal borders. They ran schools, attracted students and representatives from distant regions, and met in councils that gave their decisions a wide reach. Their authority was not limited to ritual. They also acted as judges, and their courts could rival the political leadership in real power. Even with nobles and priestly networks stretching across the land, Gaul never formed a stable national union. Instead, separate federations rose in different regions. In the north, the Belgae linked many tribes together. Along the Atlantic fringe near Brittany, coastal peoples formed their own groupings. In the centre, rivalry split the country into competing camps, with one cluster of tribes aligned around the Aedui, while others leaned toward the Arverni and Sequani. These divisions created openings for outside intervention, and that danger soon became immediate. One internal struggle in particular pulled foreign power into the heart of Gaul. The Sequani and Arverni, unable to overcome their rivals, sought help across the Rhine and called on Ariovistus, a leader of the Suebi. German groups had crossed into Gaul before, sometimes as settlers, sometimes as raiders. Ariovistus was different. He aimed not merely to gain plunder or temporary influence, but to carve out permanent domination. After defeating his opponents, he took hostages and imposed tribute. Soon, the Sequani discovered that their ally could be more oppressive than the enemies they had been trying to defeat. Appeals were sent to Rome, especially by the Aedui, but the response was evasive. Roman politics was distracted, and the easiest choice was to postpone decisions and flatter the intruder with the title of friend. Caesar regarded this as a dangerous kind of weakness. To him, accommodating aggression only invited more of it. He reached his province determined to reassert Roman authority and push the Rhine frontier back into place. Before that problem could be resolved, a new crisis surged in from the east. The Helvetii, a powerful Celtic people living in what is now Switzerland, had grown exhausted by pressure and raids. Instead of continuing a defensive struggle in their homeland, they chose migration. Their plan was drastic: burn towns and villages, gather the population into a single moving mass, and seek a new home in the richer lands of southern Gaul. The most direct route required moving along the Rhone, and for that they asked Caesar for passage through Roman-controlled territory. Caesar had only a small force immediately available, so he stalled with negotiations while buying time. He ordered the bridge at Geneva destroyed and built a long fortified line along the vulnerable stretch of riverbank, where crossing was possible. When the defences were complete, the answer was clear: no passage. The Helvetii attempted to force the crossing and were beaten back. But they found another way. Through diplomacy and influence, helped by Dumnorix, a prominent anti-Roman figure among the Aedui, they persuaded the Sequani to let them pass through a narrow corridor between mountain and river. Caesar had no choice but to respond with speed. He hurried back to Italy, raised reinforcements, and returned with a much stronger army. By then, the migrating host was moving slowly across the Saône. Caesar struck the rear elements still on the far bank, destroying them, then crossed and began pressing the main body northward. For days the Romans shadowed the migration, looking for a decisive opening. Supplies became a problem, and the unreliability of Gallic cavalry support made matters worse. Caesar turned toward Bibracte, the Aedui stronghold, to secure provisions. The movement looked like retreat, and the Helvetii took the bait, attacking the Romans in a strong position. Caesar formed his legions in depth and absorbed the first shock. The Roman infantry held firm against the furious rush, then drove the attackers back toward the plain. At that moment, a second Helvetian force struck the Roman flank, forcing Caesar to pull reserves into a new line. The fight dragged on into darkness. Eventually, the Roman assault broke into the wagon ring around the enemy camp. The Helvetii fled. Once defeated, they could not secure shelter or support elsewhere in Gaul and were compelled to surrender. Caesar's decision afterward was practical and political. Survivors were sent back to their original region to hold the frontier against further German movement. The victory had removed a moving crisis and also placed Caesar in the role of protector for many Gallic communities that feared displacement and invasion. With the Helvetii subdued, Caesar turned to the German threat. At a broad Gallic gathering, he heard complaints against Ariovistus from tribes that had suffered under his demands. Caesar sent demands of his own, hostages returned, and an end to new German crossings. Ariovistus answered with open contempt. In response, Caesar chose war. He marched rapidly and seized Vesontio, a crucial town that could provide supplies and serve as a base. There, he faced a quieter enemy: fear within his own ranks. Tales of enormous, battle-hardened Germans spread through the camp. Some officers sought excuses to leave, Others spoke openly of disaster. Soldiers wrote wills and muttered about refusing to march. Caesar confronted the crisis directly. He summoned commanders and centurions and delivered a challenge that mixed pride and pressure, declaring that he would go forward even if only one legion followed. The display worked. Shame and discipline restored momentum. The campaign became a contest of movement and position. Ariovistus tried to cut Caesar off from supply lines, slipping past and threatening the Roman rear. Caesar sought battle but was repeatedly denied it, and then answered with a maneuver of his own, establishing a second camp beyond the enemy's line and forcing contact. When the clash finally came, the fighting swung unevenly. On one wing, the Romans drove the Germans back, but on the other, a crisis developed. The situation was rescued by timely reinforcement from young Crassus, who brought reserves into the decisive point. The German line broke. Survivors fled toward the Rhine, pursued by cavalry. Ariovistus escaped with a small remnant, but his attempt to build a German power base in Gaul was shattered. In a single campaigning season, Caesar had ended two threats at once: the mass migration that could destabilize the province, and the German pressure that could turn parts of Gaul into a permanent foothold for Rhine-side powers. The Roman frontier had reached the river that would become, for a long time, the empire's symbolic boundary. The following year, Caesar made it clear he did not intend to withdraw. He placed his legions in winter quarters within Gallic territory, a message more powerful than any speech. In the north, the Belgic Confederation viewed this as an approaching net and mobilized, early to resist. Caesar moved fast again, reaching the land of the Remi and accepting their friendship, securing a base and local support. He then took a defensive position near the Aisne. Even with 8 legions, he avoided a head-on collision with an enemy that seemed vast in numbers and fought instead to protect his communications and wait for coalition politics to corrode unity. Over time, strain and fear of local raids persuaded Belgic leaders to send contingents home. The withdrawal became disorder when Roman cavalry and selected legions pursued aggressively. Caesar then struck rapidly at individual tribes. First, the Suessiones, then the Bellovaci, forcing surrender, disarmament, and hostages. Not all opponents collapsed so easily. The Nervii chose ambush. On the upper Samba, they launched a sudden attack as Roman forces were building camp and scouting. Cavalry was swept away. The enemy crossed the stream and slammed into the infantry before lines were properly formed. On the left, veteran legions stabilized and drove attackers back. On the right, units were thrown into confusion and nearly broken. Caesar moved into the crisis personally, rallying by presence as much as orders. The Roman line held under intense pressure until Labienus redirected support and the cavalry returned. The Nervii resisted stubbornly and suffered catastrophic losses. With that, Roman dominance among the Belgic groups became a reality, and winter camps were planted deep in central Gaul. While the legions rested, trouble flared on the Atlantic coast. The Veneti and related seafaring peoples stretching along the shoreline from the Loire toward the Seine seized Roman envoys who had come to requisition grain. It was a deliberate challenge. Caesar divided responsibilities among his commanders. One held the north, another secured the Loire region. Crassus advanced into Aquitaine, while Caesar himself moved against the coastal rebels. The Veneti fought from cliffs and island strongholds, using ships and local waters to avoid pitched battle. Caesar responded by building a fleet during the winter. When it arrived under Decimus Brutus, the conflict shifted. Roman crews used a simple but effective tactic: disabling the rigging of the Veneti sailing ships, so they became helpless against oared galleys. The Veneti fleet was destroyed. The punishment was harsh, leaders executed, Population sold into slavery meant as a warning that the seizure of Roman representatives would be answered with exemplary violence. Elsewhere, Roman operations succeeded. Aquitaine was subdued as far as the Pyrenees, and the Roman web tightened across the west. By now, Gaul lay under Roman supremacy in principle, but not yet in security. Discontented elites could still seek help from Britain or from German groups across the Rhine. German pressure reappeared quickly when two tribes, pushed from their lands, crossed into Gaul and sought settlement. Caesar moved to block expansion and refused their demands for territory. Negotiations, in his view, were used to gain time while cavalry returned. When his forces suffered a treacherous attack, he responded with ruthless decisiveness. Leaders were seized, and the tribes were struck while disorganized. Many were killed. Others were driven into the Rhine. To magnify the shock, Caesar crossed the river itself. A bridge was built with astonishing speed, and the army marched into German territory to support friendly groups and demonstrate reach. The main German power avoided battle by retreating into forests. After laying waste to hostile lands, Caesar withdrew, dismantling the bridge as a statement that the crossing had been a choice, not a necessity. In the same spirit, he turned toward Britain. The island had long been tied to Gaul by trade, kinship, and intermittent support for resistance. Caesar gathered ships, loaded 2 legions, and crossed the Channel. The landing was contested, and the soldiers hesitated in deep water under enemy pressure until a standard-bearer set the example, wading forward and forcing the rest to follow. Once ashore, the defenders scattered. Diplomacy began, but nature intervened. Storms damaged ships and disrupted cavalry transport. Sensing weakness, local forces attacked again. Caesar repelled assaults, but withdrew without attempting deeper conquest. The following summer, he returned with a larger force. This time, the landing was unopposed, but storms again delayed operations. Inland, a leader emerged, who avoided decisive engagement and relied on sudden attacks with war chariots. Caesar crossed the Thames and took a fortified position, but the conquest of Britain proved beyond the scope of his immediate resources and priorities. He accepted pledges, tribute promises, and political arrangements favouring friendly groups, then returned to Gaul. Britain remained outside Roman control for decades, a land too difficult and too uncertain to justify the cost at that moment. Back in Gaul, the price of these expeditions became visible. Resistance was spreading. Dumnorix, who had opposed Roman dominance, tried to avoid service and was killed while attempting to leave, a sign that Caesar would tolerate no ambiguity among allied elites. During Caesar's absence, Gallic nobles coordinated rebellion across wide areas. Supply scarcity forced Caesar to disperse legions into separate winter camps, a vulnerability his opponents exploited. At Aduatuca, a Roman detachment under Sabinus and Cotta faced assault from the Eburones, led by Ambiorix. The position was defensible, but Sabinus accepted a deceptive offer of safe passage and led the force into a trap. Sabinus was killed while trying to negotiate. Cotta fought stubbornly until the unit was annihilated. The victory electrified resistance. Reinforced insurgents moved against the camp of Quintus Cicero, who refused to bargain and held firm behind defences. Multiple messengers were caught, but eventually word reached Caesar. He marched with only 2 legions, moving fast enough that smoke from burning villages signalled his approach. He then used deception, appearing cautious until a sudden attack scattered the besiegers. Winter prevented complete suppression. Fighting continued as new leaders sought to widen the war. Labienus dealt with threats in the northeast, defeating attackers through tactical feints and brutal counterstrokes before German assistance could fully materialize. Caesar responded to renewed instability with another crossing of the Rhine, again as a demonstration meant to intimidate and discourage alliances. The Eburones, blamed for the destruction of the Roman detachment, were hunted with relentless severity. By late summer, the north had been forced into a grim quiet. Then, the most dangerous phase began. While Caesar was in northern Italy, the resistance in the south produced a single rallying figure, Vercingetorix, a young Arvernian noble who rapidly drew tribes into a common cause. This was closer to a national rising than Gaul had seen before. The strategy aimed to isolate Caesar, block routes, and threaten the Roman province itself. Caesar answered with speed that startled his enemies. He moved through harsh terrain in winter conditions, drawing Vercingetorix away toward home defence, then raced with cavalry to rejoin his legions. Vercingetorix shifted tactics, deciding that the Roman army could be defeated by hunger. Fields, towns, and stores were burned, forage denied, and Roman movements harassed by superior cavalry. One city, Avaricum, was spared against the logic of this strategy, and it became the focus of siege. The Gallic main force held to difficult ground. Roman supply lines were strained. Still, the legions refused to abandon the operation. When the city finally fell, the aftermath was savage, driven by exhaustion and rage. Caesar then split operations again. Labienus moved north to contain unrest, while Caesar advanced against the Arverni heartland. His path was blocked by the fortress of Gergovia. The position was strong, and Caesar lacked enough troops to encircle it fully. He attempted an assault. Initial success turned into confusion as units pressed too far and lost cohesion. The Romans were driven back with serious losses. For the first time in the campaign, Caesar retreated under pressure, and the psychological effect was immediate. The Aedui defected. Revolts stirred elsewhere. Advisors urged withdrawal into the safer old province, but Caesar refused to abandon his northern forces. Labienus fought his way out and rejoined him, preserving the army's unity. The decisive turning point came when Vercingetorix, now chosen as commander over a broader coalition, met Caesar's army near the borders of the Sequani. The Gallic cavalry expected superiority, but Caesar's newly recruited German horsemen broke them in open fighting. Abandoning the field, Vercingetorix withdrew into Alesia, a fortified hill stronghold. Caesar, with his forces unified, committed to a siege on an extraordinary scale. Lines were drawn completely around the position. When relief forces gathered from across Gaul, the Romans built a second ring of fortifications facing outward. The legionaries fought with tools as much as swords, digging, building, and reinforcing in relentless cycles. Attacks came from inside and outside, testing weak points. At moments, the Roman lines nearly collapsed. Caesar rushed reserves to crises. Labienus gathered every available man for a desperate counterattack when the perimeter was breached. Cavalry strikes on the rear of the relief army helped complete the rout. Alesia's defenders, starving and isolated, had no further path. After the final failure, Vercingetorix chose surrender. He rode into the Roman camp in full arms and gave himself up, hoping to spare his people further destruction. Caesar kept him alive for later display and execution, a reminder that Rome's memory of resistance was long and unforgiving. Gaul, crushed and exhausted, could no longer sustain unified war. Isolated pockets resisted. Some tribes attempted renewed independence, some fortresses held out. But none could reverse the outcome. The last phase became consolidation, securing alliances, punishing remaining threats, and laying groundwork for a stable provincial order. Full administrative organisation would be completed later, but the outlines of a new Roman Gaul were already taking shape. For Caesar, personally, the Gallic years changed the scale of his power and the clarity of his judgment. Far from the daily quarrels of the capital, he saw Roman politics from a distance and measured its smallness against the responsibilities of empire. Continuous campaigning, logistical strain, and the need to manage allies and enemies forced a harder discipline than courtroom triumphs and street rivalries ever could. The experience sharpened patience, built loyalty among troops, and taught him how to turn fear, speed, and organisation into decisive advantage. By the time Gaul was subdued, he possessed not only prestige, but a seasoned army and a reputation that could no longer be contained by the old political rules. While Caesar fought and built power in the north, Rome itself was slipping into disorder. Pompey remained in the capital without the direct instruments needed to impose calm. The streets were dominated by violent gangs led by ambitious men who treated politics as a form of controlled chaos. Clodius was the most notorious symbol of that reality. With no police force and no loyal troops to stabilize the city, Pompey tried to counter street violence with street tactics and found himself outmatched. The situation grew so dangerous that he withdrew into isolation, fearing assassination. Eventually, the scale of the unrest pushed him to support the recall of Cicero, partly as a counterweight to Clodius. Clodius answered by seeking alliances of convenience, even with groups that had once opposed him, while new rivals organised armed followers of their own. For months, Rome became a battlefield of factions. When the formal vote finally took place, crowds came in from across Italy in a massive demonstration, and Cicero returned amid scenes that felt like a public triumph. The celebration tempted Cicero into believing that the old constitutional order might yet be revived, and that Pompey might be drawn away from the alliance that had dominated the state. The illusion was understandable. The coalition of three powerful men was unpopular across social classes. Many resented their dominance and spoke of lost freedom. Pompey himself seemed uneasy, sensing that Caesar's victories were beginning to overshadow his own earlier fame. He wanted a new command that could restore his prominence, and he explored ways to obtain one. A shortage of grain provided the excuse for a proposal that would have given Pompey sweeping authority over food supply throughout the empire, along with control of funds and the ability to command resources across provincial boundaries. The Senate resisted granting such expansive power again. It approved an assignment that looked impressive and useful, supervising grain for several years, yet withheld the broader authority that could have turned it into a second extraordinary command. Pompey soon sought another path, the lucrative mission of restoring the Egyptian king to the throne. Opposition in the Senate, aided by religious warnings and tactical delays, blocked the plan by playing rival claimants against one another. Again, the pattern repeated. Pompey's ambitions and the Senate's jealousy could not coexist within the old republican framework. The Senate rejected cooperation with the one man who might have been its strongest protector, and by doing so helped drive him back toward the very alliance it feared. For a short time, Rome looked as if it might be moving against the coalition. Electoral setbacks for Caesar's supporters and courtroom victories for Cicero's allies encouraged talk of a republican recovery. Cicero, emboldened, threatened to challenge the validity of land distributions carried out under Caesar's earlier legislation. The move was intended as a rallying signal, but it produced the opposite effect. It pushed the triumvirs back together. Caesar brought Crassus into consultation, then arranged a meeting with Pompey in northern Italy. The gathering became a demonstration of power, attended by officials and senators who understood which direction the wind was blowing. The result was a renewed pact with clearer rewards, a joint consulship for Pompey and Crassus, major provincial commands for both, and an extension of Caesar's own command along with the promise of future high office. The bargain stabilized their partnership by giving each man formal authority to match his ambition. This renewed arrangement effectively placed the strongest provinces and armies under their control. Pompey, though assigned Spain, remained in Rome and ruled through deputies, focusing on watching political developments and protecting his interests. The Senate, confronted with superior force and exhausted by factional failure, submitted. Cicero, recognizing how little leverage remained, withdrew his challenge and adapted, even praising Caesar publicly and defending men he had once opposed. The only unbending resistance came from figures like Cato, who attempted obstruction and denunciations but lacked the numbers and the tools to reverse the trend. By the time the alliance was rebuilt, the Republic's centre of gravity had shifted decisively away from debate and tradition, and toward a small circle of men whose power rested on money, offices, and armies. Political life in Rome did not settle into calm simply because three powerful men dominated the state. The struggle continued relentlessly in two arenas where ambition could still be measured and punished: elections and trials. Voting days became theatres of organised corruption. The old, tangled procedures of the assemblies, meant for a smaller and simpler republic, now offered endless points of leverage. Money changed hands openly. Pressure was applied in crowds, in private meetings, and through networks of clients and brokers. Both the men who claimed to defend the constitution and the men who benefited from the triumviral arrangement used the same tools, and neither side showed much shame about it. Even so, results still shifted from year to year, proving that the system was not completely captured. One season saw Pompey and Crassus take the highest offices without serious difficulty, while Caesar's dependable ally Vatinius outpaced Cato in the race for a major magistracy. The next season the tide turned. Cato gained the position he had been denied, and an aristocrat hostile to Caesar's circle, Domitius, reached the consulship. These swings mattered less for policy than for momentum. Each result was read as a sign that the balance of fear and hope in Rome had shifted again, and each contest sharpened the bitterness between the camps. The law courts were just as vicious. Political trials were not simply about guilt or innocence. They were public battles where reputations could be destroyed and careers ended. Men associated with the triumviral order were targeted with particular fury. Vatinius faced prosecution under intense hostility and survived only because Caesar's influence intervened at the critical moment. Gabinius, by contrast, was not protected. Pompey, as so often, hesitated at exactly the wrong time. He allowed Gabinius to be sacrificed, partly because Crassus and the financial interests were eager for revenge, and partly because Pompey rarely managed personal alliances with a steady hand. In Rome, these courtroom wars served as a substitute for the kind of direct political contest that the presence of dominant figures had made difficult. While the capital churned, trouble was gathering in the east. The first signs looked like the familiar disorder of frontier politics, pressure from Parthia on Armenia, and rival claimants struggling over the Parthian throne. Syria's governor, Gabinius, had reasons to intervene. Yet before he could act decisively, a different mission pulled him away, one that linked Roman power to the unstable politics of Egypt. Ptolemy had been driven from his throne, and restoring him suited the interests of the leading men at Rome, even if it did not follow the normal channels of authorization. A Roman force marched, met resistance near the frontier and along the Nile, and broke the insurgents with little difficulty. Ptolemy returned, and the old oppressive order reasserted itself. The operation had been carried out without the Senate's formal approval, but it matched the wishes of those who truly controlled Roman decisions at the time. When Gabinius returned, Crassus was ready to take command of the army intended for a Parthian war. He wanted more than wealth and influence. He wanted glory that could stand beside Caesar's campaigns in Gaul and Pompey's earlier victories. That hunger for a heroic conquest made him reckless. He dismissed safer routes and chose the most direct approach, a straight push into the open Mesopotamian wastes. Rather than following the river in a measured advance, he marched into a landscape that offered few landmarks, little water and no shelter from mounted enemies. Local guidance, provided by a chieftain whose loyalty was doubtful, led the Romans into a trap. The Parthians understood exactly how to fight this kind of war. Their strength was cavalry, armoured lancers who could crash into formations, and vast numbers of horse archers who could keep distance and rain arrows without giving infantry a chance to close. Their leadership had deliberately kept infantry away from this battlefield and used mobile forces alone. The Roman legions, packed in dense blocks, became targets on an empty plain where speed belonged to the enemy. Roman javelins could not answer a storm of arrows launched from riders who never stood still. A desperate counterattack was attempted. Publius Crassus, commanding cavalry and selected light troops, drove forward with energy and courage. The Parthians allowed the force to separate from the main body, then wrapped it in a moving ring of horsemen. Cut off, overwhelmed, and unable to break free, Publius and many of his officers chose death over capture. Most of his men were killed or taken. The main army fought on as the attacks returned, wave after wave, until darkness ended the day. When the Parthians withdrew for the night, the Romans fled toward Carrhae, abandoning wounded men who could not be carried. From there, the remnants tried to reach safer ground near the hills, hoping to escape into terrain less favourable to cavalry. The Parthians, fearing their prey might slip away, offered talks. Crassus, pressured by exhausted troops and desperate for any exit, agreed. Suspicion flared when Parthians moved aggressively during the meeting. Fighting broke out. Crassus and his staff were cut down, and the army collapsed into surrender, dispersal, or slaughter. The scale of the disaster was shocking. A large portion of the invading force was gone. Many survivors were taken with their standards, and only a fraction returned. It was not simply a defeat. It was proof of a structural weakness. Roman infantry, superb in close combat, could be humiliated when exposed on open ground to overwhelming mounted archery and lancers. The empire had learned this lesson before in other regions, yet it had never corrected its shortage of effective cavalry and light troops. Carrhae made the penalty for that failure unmistakable. Yet Parthia did not exploit its victory with the energy that might have changed the map. Cassius, one of the few senior officers who had shown steadiness during the catastrophe, took control of what remained an organized defense. Raiding parties were checked, and when a larger Parthian force later overran parts of Syria and pinned Cassius in Antioch, he still held on with weak legions rebuilt from wreckage. He resisted assaults, then struck hard during the Parthians' withdrawal, trapping them in a killing zone and inflicting heavy losses. A later governor, Bibulus, offered little strategic brilliance, but he was spared by Parthian internal politics. A truce was made, and Parthian attention turned back inward. Back in the Roman world, the impact of Carrhae went beyond military loss. Crassus's death removed the one man who had been an equal partner in the alliance balancing Caesar and Pompey. The relationship between the surviving two had already been strained. Julia, Pompey's wife and Caesar's daughter, had died earlier, and with her went a personal bond that had softened rivalry. There was not yet open war between Caesar and Pompey, and practical cooperation still occurred. Caesar even drew resources from Pompey when emergencies demanded it. But the direction of events was pulling them apart, and Rome's streets supplied the spark that would change political calculations. Violence in the city had been growing for years, fueled by faction leaders who commanded gangs and treated elections as street warfare. Clodius and Milo, rival organizers of intimidation, pushed the city toward chaos. Then, an encounter on the Appian Way turned into a killing. Clodius died. His supporters gathered the urban underworld, displayed the body, and whipped the crowd into fury. Riot followed. In a symbolic act of rage, the Senate House itself was burned as part of the violence surrounding the funeral. Milo was trapped in his own home. Panic spread. In the confusion, some voices demanded that Pompey be given extraordinary power as a saviour. Pompey was willing to accept a dominant role, but only if it came from the Senate and carried a stamp of legitimacy. He was made sole consul, an office that, in theory, was meant to be shared. With that authority, he acted decisively. Bribery and electoral manipulation were attacked more aggressively, and the courts were put under tighter control. A special inquiry followed the riots. The judgments were notably even-handed. Milo was condemned, but so were figures on the other side who had inflamed the crowd. Cicero, bound by personal obligation and political ties, agreed to defend Milo. Yet the atmosphere was poisonous. Soldiers lined the forum, and the crowd's agitation was visible. Cicero's performance faltered under pressure, and the speech delivered in court did not match the polished version later circulated. Milo, exiled, joked bitterly when he read the improved text afterward, noting that a better speech might have cost him the fine food he now enjoyed far from Rome. Cicero found a different kind of satisfaction later by helping secure the conviction of one of the agitators, even against Pompey's efforts to shield him. Pompey used the year to build a stronger personal position while presenting himself as the defender of order. Italy was called to arms, and the levies were bound by oath of loyalty to him personally. He chose as colleague a man tied to him by family connection and influence, and he secured an extension of his command in Spain. At the same time, reforms were introduced that reshaped the political machinery. One rule enforced a delay between holding office in Rome and receiving a provincial command. On paper, it looked like a measure against corruption and opportunism. In practice, it gave the Senate a powerful advantage. It could now distribute governorships more freely and fill vacancies with its own nominees, tightening aristocratic control over provincial administration. By this point, an alliance between Pompey and the Senate's Republican majority became not only possible, but useful to both. The senators needed a figure with an army behind him, not simply a voice of principle. They had learned from earlier failures that Caesar could not be checked by speeches or procedural obstruction alone. Many of them believed Pompey could be used to stop Caesar, and then, because of his famous indecision, would not use victory to crush the Republic entirely. Pompey, for his part, needed a respectable justification for breaking with Caesar. Defending legality and tradition offered that banner. Still, neither side moved immediately. Pompey remained tied by old obligations, and even hardened politicians hesitated to tear away the last remaining forms of constitutional order before the trap was fully built. The central dispute that followed was not simple, and it was not purely about ambition. Caesar's vital interest was time. He needed to keep his provincial command until he could enter the consulship without becoming vulnerable. If he dismissed his army and returned as a private citizen, prosecution awaited, an attack that could end his career and strip him of protection. He believed that once holding the highest office again, reforms could be pushed through by political skill rather than force. That plan depended on avoiding a dangerous gap between laying down command and taking up new authority. The legal framework, however, offered obstacles. The expiry date of Caesar's command and the timing of elections did not align neatly. In addition, the law required candidates to be physically present in Rome to canvass. For a general in command, appearing in the city could mean surrendering legal protection and forfeiting authority. Caesar had anticipated these difficulties and had arranged exemptions through popular legislation. Pompey had supported at least one of those exemptions, but then, true to his habit of contradiction, backed a broader rule that restored the requirement of personal presence. A later clause was attached to soften the injustice by protecting those already exempted. Yet the way it was handled left the legal status questionable. The result was a situation in which Caesar's enemies could claim to be acting within the letter of the law while bending procedure to reach a predetermined outcome. Law became a weapon, shaped and reshaped depending on who held the blade. The first formal push against Caesar came when a consul tried to force the issue early, but discussion was postponed under pressure. In the meantime, Caesar bought political support and gained crucial allies. One of them, Curio, was an aristocrat with a reputation for glamour and shifting loyalties, now searching for a role as a serious statesman. He identified a vulnerability in the Senate's position. If Caesar was demanded to resign, why not demand the same of Pompey? Curio proposed simultaneous disarmament. The idea was politically brilliant because it sounded fair and it split the Senate. After voting to pressure Caesar and rejecting a similar pressure on Pompey, the Senate nonetheless passed Curio's broader proposal by a huge majority. The contradiction exposed the real motive behind the campaign and weakened the moral confidence of those pushing hardest for confrontation. Meanwhile, preparations for conflict were already underway. Under the excuse of a Parthian war, the Senate demanded legions from both Caesar and Pompey. Pompey also requested the return of a legion Caesar had previously lent him. Caesar's forces were reduced by 2 legions in this maneuver. The stated destination was the eastern frontier, but the troops were kept in Italy, stationed where they could be used against Caesar, rather than against Parthia. This was a quiet step towards civil war, taken under official language and public pretenses. Tensions escalated when a report spread that Caesar had moved forces toward Italy. The report was false, but it was used as fuel. A consul tried to have Caesar declared an enemy of the state, and wanted Pompey ordered to march. Curio exposed the lie and blocked the motion. The Senate hesitated to endorse the extreme step, yet the consul and his allies rushed to Pompey anyway, urging him to save the Republic and granting him informal authority to take control of the troops at Capua and raise new forces. Pompey accepted this half-legal commission, and that was enough. Events were now being driven by a smaller faction whose hatred and impatience pushed faster than the state's official machinery. Caesar responded with calculated restraint, understanding that moderation could be as useful as strength. He offered a compromise. He would surrender much of his command and most of his legions if he could keep a reduced position and limited force until elections protected him. The offer met many of the demands of moderates. It also placed the burden of refusal on his opponents. Caesar wanted his terms read formally to the Senate, so the record would show who rejected peace. At the start of the new year, Curio returned to Rome carrying Caesar's message. The consuls tried to prevent it from being heard, but tribunes insisted it be read. The letter offered 2 paths: a partial resignation from Caesar in exchange for security, or simultaneous disarmament by Caesar and Pompey. It also contained a clear warning: if the Senate attempted to strip him by force, he would respond with force. The hardline consuls refused to allow a vote on the proposals. Pompey, speaking through allies, signalled that a showdown could no longer be postponed. Under intimidation and pressure, the Senate passed a decree demanding Caesar surrender his command by a fixed date, or be treated as a traitor. When the tribunes vetoed the decree, the conflict sharpened. The next step followed quickly. Emergency measures were declared, loyal magistrates were called upon to defend the state, and Caesar's allied tribunes fled the city in disguise to join him. Their flight gave Caesar a powerful political narrative, an appeal to the violation of sacred civic protections and to the idea that constitutional forms had been crushed by faction. In Ravenna, Caesar faced the final test, the loyalty of the troops near him. He addressed them not as an abstract political audience, but as veterans whose identity had been forged in hard years of campaign. He spoke of insults, injuries, and the humiliation of seeing tribunes driven out, and he framed the coming decision as both personal defence and moral retaliation. Once he was certain of their commitment, he ordered the distant legions to march and moved south. The crossing of the Rubicon turned political crisis into open war. When Julius Caesar stepped across the Rubicon, the balance of power appeared to lie overwhelmingly with his opponents. His authority rested only on the provinces he directly controlled. Northern Italy welcomed him with enthusiasm, yet beyond the Alps the mood was mixed. Many Gallic communities had accepted Roman rule with reluctance and watched events cautiously, uncertain whether to risk loyalty to a conqueror whose future seemed doubtful. In Rome itself, he possessed little visible support. Most senators and established politicians stood with Pompey, and even within Caesar's own circle there were few experienced commanders. The defection of Labienus, once his most trusted marshal, deprived him of the only lieutenant capable of independent operations on a grand scale. On paper, the situation looked perilous. What Caesar lacked in numbers and prestige, he compensated with unity of command. His enemies were a coalition, constantly debating, questioning, and second-guessing one another. Caesar alone decided, and his decisions were carried out without hesitation. He towered so far above his subordinates that no rival could emerge in his camp. The veterans who had marched with him through Gaul saw him not merely as a leader, but as the embodiment of their own victories. They were ready to follow him anywhere, even against the republic they had once served. 9 hardened legions formed the core of his strength, and the recruiting grounds of northern Italy promised a steady stream of replacements. Pompey's side, by contrast, possessed the outward symbols of legitimacy. The Senate, still recognized as the lawful government, had allied itself with him. The capital and its institutions were in his hands, allowing him to present his cause as the defense of tradition against rebellion. Bankers feared that Caesar would cancel debts. Small landowners dreaded a return of anarchy. To many Italians, Pompey seemed the safer guardian of order. Yet beneath this appearance lay deep weakness. The senatorial camp was divided by jealousies. Noblemen quarrelled over rank and strategy as if the enemy were distant rather than advancing. Wealthy supporters offered applause but little sacrifice. When danger approached, this impressive coalition began to crumble. Beyond Italy, the picture looked more favourable for Pompey. Recent appointments had filled the provinces with men loyal to the Senate. Client kings in the east owed their thrones to Pompey's earlier campaigns, and the ruler of Numidia feared everything from Caesar's success. Spain held 7 seasoned legions, and Greece and Asia could provide a powerful fleet. Pompey boasted that he needed only to stamp his foot to raise an army. The boast was not entirely empty, yet the forces in Italy were unprepared. The only troops immediately available were 2 legions originally Caesar's, whose loyalty could not be trusted. The rest were raw levies without cohesion. Caesar acted before this machine could be assembled. With a single legion, he advanced rapidly along the Adriatic coast, securing town after town. Offers of negotiation were met with demands that he first surrender his command, terms he could not accept. The swiftness of his movement created panic. Pompeian levies in Picenum melted away, and even the capital trembled. Pompey withdrew to the south, intending to use Apulia as a base for evacuation if necessary. He ordered Domitius, stationed at Corfinium, to join him, but Domitius refused, convinced he could check Caesar alone. The town was soon surrounded. After a brief resistance, Domitius attempted to flee, but his own soldiers mutinied and surrendered. Caesar released the captured officers without punishment and incorporated the common soldiers into his army, a gesture that won him sympathy across Italy. Recognizing that Italy could not be held, Pompey executed a skillful withdrawal to Brundisium and ferried half his forces across the sea before Caesar arrived. Attempts to block the harbour failed, and Pompey escaped to Epirus with minimal loss. The lack of a fleet prevented pursuit. Caesar found himself once again between two dangers: Pompey in the east and powerful armies in Spain. True to his method, he chose immediate attack on the nearer threat. Before leaving Italy, he tried to stabilize the situation. His clemency had already calmed fears of proscriptions. Extremists in his own party complained, but ordinary Italians welcomed a victor who did not plunder. The Senate remnants refused to cooperate, so Caesar governed through praetors and tribunes, even forcing open the treasury when obstruction continued. Sicily and Sardinia were secured to guarantee grain supplies, and order gradually returned. The Spanish campaign became a masterpiece of improvisation. Pompey's commanders held strong positions along the Ebro, but they were deployed too far forward. Early skirmishes went badly for Caesar, and floods destroyed his bridges, leaving his army short of food. He responded by building light boats, crossing upstream, and turning the enemy's flank. When the Pompeians tried to retreat into Celtiberia, Caesar's cavalry harried them relentlessly, cutting off mountain passes and water sources. Trapped and starving, the enemy capitulated. In 3 months, Spain was won, a region that had resisted conquerors for generations. Elsewhere, fortune was harsher. In Africa, Curio advanced recklessly and was destroyed by the cavalry of King Juba. Along the Illyrian coast, Caesar's squadrons were defeated, and a detachment of his legions surrendered. Yet the main theatre lay in the east, where Pompey had gathered a vast coalition army supported by a dominant fleet. Caesar crossed the Adriatic with only part of his forces, landing at Epirus and seizing coastal towns before Pompey could react. Reinforcements later slipped through the naval blockade, but Pompey entrenched himself near the sea, confident that supply lines and numbers would decide the war. Caesar attempted the impossible task of surrounding the Pompeian camp near Dyrrhachium. The lines became too long to hold, and Pompey finally broke out, inflicting a serious defeat. It was Caesar's worst reverse, yet Pompey hesitated to press the advantage. Caesar withdrew to Thessaly, drawing the enemy inland away from the safety of the fleet. The decisive encounter came near Pharsalus. Pompey commanded a force almost twice the size of Caesar's, and possessed overwhelming cavalry. Caesar anticipated the plan to crush his right wing with horsemen and prepared a hidden reserve of veteran cohorts. When the battle opened, Pompey's cavalry drove back Caesar's, but the reserve met them with aggressive close combat, shattering the charge. Caesar then released his final line, and the Pompeian centre collapsed. The camp was stormed before nightfall, and thousands surrendered at dawn. The civil war of the Republic effectively ended on that field. Pompey fled eastward, seeking refuge among former allies. Syria and Cyprus turned him away, and he turned to Egypt, where he had once exercised influence. There, On the shore of Pelusium, he was murdered by agents of the young Egyptian king, eager to please the new master of Rome. Pompey's life closed in tragedy. He had been a capable soldier and an honest man in a corrupt age, yet politically he lacked the firmness required by his extraordinary position. Fate placed him in a role too large for his cautious nature. Caesar pursued to Alexandria and became entangled in Egypt's dynastic quarrel. Fascinated by Cleopatra and convinced he could impose order, he lingered too long. The city rose against him, and for months he was besieged with a small force until relief arrived from Asia Minor. After defeating the Egyptian army on the Nile and installing Cleopatra on the throne under Roman protection, he turned north to confront Pharnaces of Pontus. A lightning campaign ended at Zela, summarized in his famous phrase of arrival, sight, and victory. Meanwhile, the defeated Republican leaders regrouped in Africa under Cato and Scipio. Caesar, delayed by mutiny among his veterans and by administrative tasks in Italy, crossed later with limited forces. After months of manoeuvring, he forced battle near Thapsus. His troops attacked without orders, overwhelmed the enemy and destroyed the last organized army of the Old Republic. Many leaders chose suicide rather than capture. Cato's death became a symbol of resistance and a moral challenge to the new regime. A final uprising in Spain brought Caesar back to the field. At Munda, he faced a desperate coalition and won only after fierce fighting. The victory removed the last military opposition. Triumphs celebrated Gaul, Egypt, Pontus, and Africa, yet no Roman captive was displayed. A deliberate gesture that the war had been against enemies of the state rather than fellow citizens. With arms laid down, Caesar turned to reconstruction. He rejected the path of terror and proscription that earlier dictators had followed. Debt agitation was suppressed, but without vengeance. A broad amnesty sought to reconcile opponents, though many could not accept the loss of republican freedom. Caesar tried to draw former enemies into office, believing that inclusion would stabilize the regime. The policy earned suspicion from all sides. His followers resented restraint, and his adversaries interpreted generosity as a mask. The central challenge was political transformation. The old system, designed for a city-state, could not govern an empire. Power had to be concentrated in a single authority, capable of quick decision and impartial rule. Caesar accepted this necessity and gathered offices that placed him above every institution. The dictatorship, the tribunician power, and control over military and provincial appointments made him effectively sovereign, even if republican forms were preserved. Yet he did not intend to extinguish local life. Instead, he sought to strengthen municipal self-government across Italy and the provinces. Towns were reorganized on Roman models. New colonies were founded in Gaul and Spain. Ancient centers like Carthage and Corinth were marked for revival. Citizenship and Latin rights were extended beyond traditional limits. The goal was to replace the lost patriotism of the old republic with loyalty rooted in local communities, within a broader imperial order. Rome's crisis was not only political. By the time Caesar held power, the deeper danger lay in a slow collapse of social balance and public discipline. The capital had become a city that produced little, yet consumed endlessly. Waves of displaced farmers from Italy drifted into Rome after losing their land. Freed slaves, migrants from the eastern Mediterranean and newcomers from the western provinces joined them over time, swelling a population that depended less on steady work and more on survival inside a crowded metropolis. Many people were drawn by the promise of spectacle and easy subsistence. Grain distributions helped keep hunger at bay, but they also turned public life into a contest over favours and food. Informal associations and neighbourhood groups, once ordinary parts of urban life, could be converted into organised street power. With no real police force to impose order, violence and intimidation became common tools in political struggle, and the city's stability could be shaken by whoever controlled the loudest gangs. Caesar could not remake this world from the ground up, but he attempted to reduce the worst damage. He moved against the most dangerous urban networks, breaking up political clubs that had become instruments of coercion and placing similar societies under tight supervision. He also reshaped public relief. Instead of allowing the grain system to function as a permanent entitlement for enormous numbers, he restricted distribution to those classed as genuinely poor, cutting the list dramatically and turning a blunt giveaway into something closer to targeted support. At the same time, he pushed construction projects that created employment while also reshaping the city's civic spaces. New public buildings, new meeting areas, and expanded administrative centres were not only monuments to authority, they were also a practical attempt to keep thousands of idle hands busy. Yet his most ambitious solution aimed beyond Rome itself. He treated emigration and resettlement as a pressure valve. By sending surplus population to new settlements overseas, he tried to give the unemployed a stable livelihood and revive regions around the Mediterranean whose local economies had been hollowed out by Rome's dominance. Italy, beyond the capital, faced its own emergency. The class of small farmers that had once provided both soldiers and social stability had steadily thinned. Their plots had been absorbed into vast estates, worked by slaves, run for profit by wealthy owners who preferred scale and control to the slow returns of smallholding life. Pasture and stock raising spread across large parts of the peninsula at the expense of grain cultivation. The result was a society with little middle ground. Enormous numbers of slaves and impoverished citizens on one side, and a narrow elite on the other. Even among the rich, the appearance of power often concealed financial fragility. Prestige politics demanded lavish spending on games, gifts, public entertainments, and display. Private life followed the same pattern. Expensive homes, extravagant dining, and luxury collections became symbols of status. Many aristocrats lived on credit, not because they lacked income, but because their ambitions outran their resources. Debt was not a marginal issue, but a constant pressure, and calls for wiping the slate clean echoed whenever economic strain intensified. Caesar approached this problem with a mixture of emergency action and long-term reform. In the immediate dislocation caused by civil war, he introduced measures designed to keep debt from destroying households and provoking broader instability. Debtors were allowed to count previously paid interest against the principal, and the remaining balance could be settled through property valued at pre-war estimates, rather than depressed wartime prices. It was a compromise. Creditors still recovered something substantial, but the spiral of ruin slowed. After the crisis, measures came more structural changes. He introduced a formal bankruptcy process that protected personal freedom. An insolvent debtor could surrender assets without being thrown into prison simply for misfortune. It was a clear shift in principle. Loss of liberty was for criminals, not for those crushed by circumstances. At the same time, he tried to curb predatory lending and push wealth back into productive landholding by requiring large investors to place a significant portion of their capital into Italian property. The aim was not charity but economic direction, an attempt to steer money away from pure extraction and toward agriculture. Agriculture itself became a central theme in his domestic policy. Veteran settlements were handled with care compared to earlier experiments that had uprooted entire communities. Instead of sweeping away existing owners and planting soldiers in large, isolated blocks. He spread them among established populations, trying to preserve property rights while injecting new labour and discipline into rural life. He also targeted the labour structure of the great estates by forcing stock farmers to employ a proportion of free workers, rather than relying entirely on slaves. It was a limited requirement, but it signalled an effort to stop the countryside from becoming a landscape owned by a few and worked only by the unfree. Beyond these laws stood public works meant to strengthen Italy's internal economy, draining marshy land, improving transport routes through difficult terrain, and linking productive regions to markets more efficiently. If Rome and Italy were troubled, the provinces were often in worse condition. In the Western territories, there were still energetic communities capable of growth under stable administration. But across much of the Mediterranean world, long accustomed to external rule, provincial populations experienced Roman control less as protection than as exploitation. Official taxation was not always the main burden. The greater damage came from corruption and opportunism. Governors and their entourages treating provinces as a short-term prize, extracting money, goods, and favours before returning home. Soldiers quartered in a town could consume resources like an occupying force. Local elites were pressured for gifts, costly animals for shows, or sudden payments to satisfy demands from Rome. Even when a governor was personally restrained, tax contractors and moneylenders could be ruthless. High-interest loans trapped cities and small landowners in permanent dependence. In extreme cases, creditor violence and intimidation turned civic institutions into hostages. These practices poisoned Rome's reputation and helped trigger cycles of resentment and revolt. Caesar's response aimed at control and standardization. Provincial officials were no longer left as semi-independent rulers, far from oversight. They became administrators, answering to a central authority that could punish abuse. Some tax systems were altered to reduce opportunities for predation, and governors were restrained from arbitrary extraction. The deeper problem of usury could not be erased quickly, but the tone of government shifted. The ideal Caesar promoted was a provincial administration that acted as a shield rather than a weapon, presenting Roman authority as a source of order and appeal for the vulnerable rather than a license for the strong. This drive for order showed itself in Caesar's broader administrative style. His reforms were not improvised gestures, but part of a larger effort to make government predictable. Financial planning moved towards systematic oversight, with attempts to measure income and expenditure rather than lurching from one emergency to the next. A unified gold coinage strengthened economic coherence across the empire. Even time itself was reorganized. The calendar, long thrown off by miscalculation and manipulation, was reset into a more stable system aligned with the solar year, replacing the old confusion with a framework that could be administered reliably. These changes reveal a consistent mindset. Authority was meant to function like a well-managed machine, not a series of short-term bargains. Yet the same authority that made reform possible also made reconciliation difficult. Many senators could tolerate extraordinary power as a temporary response to chaos, but not as a permanent settlement. Public flattery grew exaggerated and honours piled up around Caesar, creating the impression of monarchy even when he spoke the language of restoration. Beneath this surface, a different mood hardened among a group who believed the old political order had been murdered in everything but name. Personal grievances mixed with ideology. One man felt slighted in rank and promotion. Another, more austere and intellectual, convinced himself that removing Caesar was a moral necessity. The circle widened to include figures who had benefited from Caesar's trust and offices, men who accepted favour while secretly preparing betrayal. The chosen moment came in early spring, when Caesar was expected to appear in the Senate before departing on a major eastern campaign. Warnings reached him, and hesitation delayed his departure from home. But a trusted associate persuaded him to go. Inside the Senate, the attack unfolded with rehearsed coordination. A petition was pressed forward as a distraction. The conspirators closed in, crowding around him under the cover of urgent appeals. The first blow was clumsy, but it served as a signal. In seconds, the scene turned into a chaotic assault. Caesar tried to resist, then staggered beneath repeated strikes, and fell near the statue of his former rival, a grim piece of stagecraft that the attackers could later interpret as symbolic justice. The murder did not reverse the transformation of the Roman world. It removed a person, not the conditions that had produced his rise. Instead of restoring the old system, it reopened the struggle for power and forced the next generation to finish the imperial construction amid new waves of conflict. Caesar's legacy remained contested because it was double-edged. He fought a civil war and concentrated authority in one man. Yet he also resisted mass terror and tried to govern with restraint. He understood the empire's administrative problems with unusual clarity and moved rapidly to impose structure where corruption and improvisation had ruled. His failure was not a lack of vision, but the impossibility of compressing a long historical transformation into a single lifetime, and the difficulty of persuading a proud elite to accept permanent rule that no longer matched their traditions.